The last thing Boba Fett ever expected was to watch his father die. One moment, Jango Fett was the most dangerous man alive. The next moment he was gone, a purple blade, a single motion, and the man who taught Boba everything he knew was lying still on the sand of an alien arena while the battle raged on around them, like nothing had happened at all. Boba was 10 years old. Nobody stopped. Nobody looked at the boy standing in the dust. The galaxy kept moving the way it always does, fast, loud, and completely indifferent to one child's loss. But that child would never forget, and everything that came after. Every contract, every hunt, every legend built around a battered green helmet traces back to that single moment on Geonosis. To understand Boba Fett, you have to start about 32 years before the Battle of Yavin. You have to go to a planet most people had never heard of. Kamino sits at the edge of charted space, past a stretch of stars that most navigation systems skip entirely. The planet is covered almost completely by ocean. Massive storms roll across the surface constantly, and the cities rise above the water on enormous stilts, towers of white and pale blue reaching up through the clouds. It is not the kind of place that shows up in travel records or trade routes. It was not meant to be found easily, but someone found it, and what they built there would change galactic history. The Kaminoans are a tall, quiet people, graceful in their movements, precise in everything they do. They have been cloning organisms for thousands of years, and they are very good at it. When the Republic came to them, or when someone came on the Republic's behalf, through channels that the official record still does not fully clarify, the Kaminoans were ready. They had the technology, they had the facilities, they had the expertise to produce something that no other civilization in the galaxy could offer. A standing army, grown from scratch, ready to fight. All they needed was a template. Jango Fett was not the kind of man who drew attention to himself unnecessarily. He was Mandalorian by culture and training. Though the exact details of his upbringing have been told differently across different sources, what every account agrees on is simpler. By the time Jango arrived on Kamino, he had built a reputation that most bounty hunters spent entire careers working toward and never reached. He was methodical, disciplined, exceptionally dangerous. And he had survived long enough in a profession that kills most of its practitioners early to carry the kind of experience that made other hunters step aside. The Kaminoans selected him for a specific reason. He had no connection to the Force, no sensitivity to it, no awareness of it, no trace of it in his genetic profile. For the purposes of building an army that might one day fight alongside, or against, Force users, a template without that variable was considered an advantage. Jango agreed to the arrangement. The payment was substantial. The terms gave him access to equipment and resources that complemented his work. The Republic, or whoever was actually funding the project, got what they needed. But Jango had one additional condition. He wanted a son. The Kaminoans found this request unusual. They could produce thousands of copies of Jango Fett. They could make him 100 identical children if he asked. What they could not immediately understand was why he wanted just one. A single sequence, unaltered, raised normally instead of deployed as a soldier. No growth acceleration. The clones they were producing for the army would be aged artificially, their development compressed so that a 10-year military timeline could produce fully trained adult soldiers. Boba would not have that done to him. He would grow at the natural pace. 1 year of development for every real year that passed. No behavioral conditioning. The clone troopers were shaped from early development to be soldiers, to function in units, to follow command structures without the hesitation that ordinary upbringing might produce. Boba would receive none of that modification. Whatever personality, whatever instincts, whatever inner life developed in him would come from his experiences and his environment, not from programming, no deployment. He was not a weapon to be used. He was, by the terms of Django's request, a child to be raised. The Kaminoans delivered exactly what was asked. The records confirm the sequence was produced according to Django's specifications. They filed the terms, noted the details, and returned to the larger work of producing 3 million soldiers. They did not ask what Django was building. That was not their concern. Boba grew up in Tipoca City. The city sits above the waves on massive support columns, its white towers rising through the cloud cover, its corridors always humming with the quiet industry of the facility below. Millions of clone troopers trained in the levels underneath, sparring, drilling, running formation exercises that would eventually produce the Republic's frontline forces. The sounds of that training drifted up through the structure constantly. It was the background noise of Boba's childhood, but his education was different from anything happening below. Django taught him directly, not through instructors or training programs, personally, one-on-one, with the kind of attention that makes lessons stick. Boba learned to handle weapons at an age when other children were still learning to read. He learned to pilot Slave I, his father's Firespray-class gunship, well before most people his age would have been allowed near a cockpit. He could navigate asteroid fields. He could identify targets at long range. He could break down and reassemble equipment in the dark. Django also took him along sometimes. Not on the most dangerous assignments, but enough. Enough for Boba to understand, from direct experience rather than description, what his father's profession actually looked like. The galaxy was not a safe place. Django did not pretend otherwise. He showed the boy what was real. But alongside the combat training and the operational exposure, Django taught him something else. He talked about keeping your word, about the Mandalorian way of doing things, not as mythology or distant tradition, but as a practical code. Honor meant something. Family meant something. You did not betray people who trusted you. You did not abandon obligations because they became difficult. These lessons came in pieces, between training sessions and flights, and the long stretches of waiting that are part of any hunter's work. They were not delivered as formal instruction. They were woven into the ordinary texture of Boba's days, the way parents pass things on, without always realizing they are doing it. The boy absorbed all of it. Their life on Kamino ended the day Obi-Wan Kenobi arrived. Kenobi had been following a trail. An assassination attempt on a Coruscant senator had led to a dead assassin, and the dead assassin had been carrying a weapon of Kaminoan manufacture. The coordinates to Kamino had been deleted from the Jedi archive, which was itself suspicious enough to confirm that there was something at those coordinates worth finding. He arrived quietly, asking questions the way Jedi do, and the Kaminoans told him what they thought he needed to know. When Kenobi met Django in his quarters, the conversation was careful on both sides. Kenobi was trying to understand what he was looking at. Django was deciding how much that mattered. Boba was present, watching from the edges of the room, quiet in the way he had learned to be quiet, taking in everything. Jedi can sense things that other people miss. Kenobi sensed that the story Django was presenting had gaps in it. The meeting ended without resolution, and then escalated into something else entirely. A fight on the rain-lashed landing platforms outside. Django bringing every weapon he had against a Jedi Knight who was extremely difficult to put down. Boba did not watch passively. He got into Slave I's gun turret and opened fire on Kenobi. A 10-year-old at the weapons controls, covering his father's escape with accuracy that surprised everyone involved. The covering fire brought Django the opening he needed. Father and son lifted off from Kamino with Kenobi in pursuit, threading through the storm, making the jump to hyperspace with a Jedi starfighter trying to lock onto their trajectory. They escaped, but the trail behind them had just gotten much harder to lose. Geonosis was where it ended. Django had commitments there, obligations to Count Dooku and the separatist network that had been gathering strength in the months before open war. He brought Boba to the planet the way he had brought him to other places. Close, present, learning. What happened next unfolded fast. A group of captured Jedi were scheduled to die in the Petranaki arena. 200 Jedi arrived instead to prevent it, led by Mace Windu, and the arena became a battlefield in moments. Battle droids, Jedi, bounty hunters, mercenaries, all of it collapsed into a single enormous chaotic fight under the rust-colored sky. Django fought in that chaos. He was good at it. He had been fighting in exactly those kinds of conditions for decades. But the odds were overwhelming, and Mace Windu was not an ordinary opponent. The duel between them lasted only seconds. Windu's purple blade cut through Django's defenses, and that was it. Fast, final. The most feared bounty hunter in the galaxy died in front of thousands of witnesses. One of those witnesses was his 10-year-old son. Boba watched his father fall. He felt something change inside him in that moment. Something that had no name yet, because he was too young to have words for it. But that would shape every decision he made for the next several decades. The man who taught him how to fly, and how to fight, and how to keep his word was gone. The battle kept going around him like it meant nothing. When the fight finally moved away from that section of the arena, Boba walked out onto the sand. He found his father's helmet where it had fallen. He picked it up with both hands. The metal was warm from the Geonosis heat. He pressed it against his forehead for a moment, the way you hold on to something when you do not know what else to do. Then he made a promise. Mace Windu would pay for this, no matter how long it took, no matter what it cost. The boy who had grown up learning about honor and family in the towers above the Camino Ocean was gone now. What was left was something quieter and much more dangerous. An orphan with a specific skill set and a specific target, and nothing left to lose. The galaxy had produced many such people. It rarely ended well for anyone involved. Boba Fett tucked his father's helmet under his arm and walked out of the arena into the dry Geonosis heat. His childhood was over. Everything else was about to begin. Boba Fett left Geonosis with two things: his father's helmet and a plan. The plan was simple the way grief is simple. Find Mace Windu, make him pay. Everything else could wait. School could wait. Safety could wait. The future could wait. There was only one thing that mattered now, and Boba intended to see it through, no matter what it cost him. He was 10 years old. He had no allies, no money, and no idea how to kill a Jedi Master. But he had his father's training, his father's ship, and a rage that had nowhere else to go. What happened next would take 2 years. It would involve some of the most dangerous people in the galaxy. It would end in failure, in chains, and in a prison cell on Coruscant. And somewhere inside all of that, underneath the revenge and the violence and the desperate planning, there was a boy who simply missed his father and did not know how to say so. That is the part the records almost missed entirely. The Clone Wars had been burning for weeks by the time Boba left Geonosis. Battles were breaking out across dozens of star systems. Republic cruisers were moving through hyperspace in every direction. The Jedi were stretched thin, managing a war on multiple fronts, while trying to hold the Senate together and keep track of separatist movements across half the galaxy. Nobody was looking for one small boy in a firespray gunship. Boba had time to think, and in that time, he reached out to the only people he knew how to reach. The contacts his father had kept, the names that came up in bounty hunting work, the edges of the criminal network that Django had moved through for years. Boba did not have relationships with these people. He had his father's name. In certain circles, that was enough to open a door. The door that opened led to Aura Singh. Aura Singh had a reputation that most people in the galaxy preferred to hear about from a safe distance. She was pale-skinned, sharp-featured, and moved with the kind of practiced calm that comes from spending years in situations where panic gets you killed. She had started her life as a Jedi Padawan, taken from her home world as a young child, trained in the temple on Coruscant, given the early foundations of Force sensitivity that the Jedi looked for in their students. Then something happened. The records on exactly what are incomplete, and Aura herself gave different accounts at different times, depending on who was asking. What is consistent across all versions is that she left the Jedi Order under circumstances that were not voluntary, and that the experience left her with a particular hatred for Force users that she spent the rest of her career acting on. She collected lightsabers, not as trophies in any conventional sense. She used them, carried them, kept them as functional weapons, and as a kind of running count of what she had taken from people who had once represented something she had been denied. She was a bounty hunter, an assassin, and by the time of the Clone Wars, one of the most consistently effective killers working in the criminal underworld. She was also, by any reasonable assessment, a terrible guardian for a grieving 10-year-old child. Boba did not have better options, so he took the one he had. What Aura provided was practical and immediate. She had resources, she had connections, she had knowledge of how the Republic military operated, where its vulnerabilities were, and how a person might get close to a high-value target without triggering the security layers that protected Jedi Masters during wartime. She also had a use for Boba, specifically, and this is worth examining, because Aura Singh did not do things out of generosity. Her interest in helping a young clone with a vendetta was not maternal. It was strategic. Boba had something valuable. He had a face that looked exactly like every clone trooper in the Republic Army. He could walk through military checkpoints, board Republic vessels, move through spaces that would have been closed to anyone else. That face was an operational asset, and Aura recognized it immediately. Boss came along as well. The Trandoshan bounty hunter was older, experienced, and motivated by the kind of straightforward appetite for violence that made him useful in situations where subtlety was less important than firepower. He joined the group without much complexity about it. There was a target. There was a plan forming. That was enough for him. The three of them made a strange constellation. A grieving child, a calculating assassin, and a predator who enjoyed his work. What passed between them as something resembling a team was never comfortable and never simple. Hondo Ohnaka, the pirate leader who would encounter Boba during this period, later gave an account of the boy that stands out from most other descriptions. Hondo was not a reliable narrator in any strict sense. He was a storyteller by nature, someone who improved his memories in the direction of a better story. But one observation he made has appeared consistently across multiple tellings. He said that even at that age, Boba Fett kept a distance inside himself that most people could not cross. He was present. He was functional. He communicated what needed to be communicated. But there was something held back. Something that nobody in that group, including Aura, was ever actually allowed near. Hondo said it reminded him of someone carrying something fragile, moving carefully so it would not break. He did not elaborate on what he thought the fragile thing was. The plan they built together centered on Boba's face. An unaltered clone looked exactly like a clone trooper. Same height at that age, same features, same genetic profile that any standard identification scan would read as Republic military. Boba could walk into certain Republic spaces without triggering automated security alerts, because the automated systems were not looking for him. They were looking for threats, and a child with a clone's face did not read as a threat. The target was the Endurance, a Venator-class star destroyer. Mace Windu was aboard. Boba infiltrated the vessel by posing as a clone cadet. one of the young trainees who moved through military ships as part of their education. Clone cadets were common enough that an additional face among them drew no particular attention. The crew saw what they expected to see: a young clone in training, learning how ships operated, doing what cadets do. Nobody looked twice. Boba spent time aboard learning the layout, identifying patrol patterns, locating the sections of the ship that a specific person would have to pass through. He moved through corridors full of men who shared his genetic profile, and felt, according to what can be reconstructed from later accounts, nothing about that particular fact that he was willing to show anyone. Then he placed the bomb. It was hidden inside Jango's helmet. That specific detail has attracted attention from everyone who has examined this period of Boba's life. And it deserves attention. Of everything Boba could have used as a container, he chose his father's helmet. The object he had carried away from Geonosis, the thing he pressed against his forehead in the arena after Jango fell. He put explosives inside it and left it where Mace Windu would find it. There are different ways to read that choice. The most direct reading is purely tactical. The helmet was a container of the right size that could be left in a plausible location without immediately suggesting a threat. That reading is probably correct as far as it goes. But it does not go all the way. Because a child who has spent weeks carrying his father's most personal possession, who has traveled across star systems with it, who has used it as the emotional anchor for everything he is trying to do, that child does not choose. It is a bomb casing without that choice, meaning something beyond tactics. The first independent act of Boba Fett's life was placing his grief at the center of a weapon and pointing it at the man responsible. The bomb detonated. The explosion tore through a section of the Endurance with significant force. Clone troopers died, men who shared Boba's face, who carried the same genetic material as he did, who had never made any choice about what they were or what they were asked to do. They were in the wrong section at the wrong moment, and they did not survive it. Boba did not stop to examine what he felt about that. The records suggest he did not feel much, or that if he did, he had no structure for processing it yet. These were the Republic's soldiers, the Republic's instrument, the same Republic that had stood by while his father died in an arena and then went back to its war as if nothing had changed. The clones were part of that system. That is the logic as far as it can be reconstructed. But there is something uncomfortable underneath it that the logic does not fully address. Those men had his face. They had grown from the same source. In any biological sense, they were closer to him than anyone else alive. He killed them trying to reach someone else. That fact does not appear to have been processed by anyone in Boba's immediate circle. Aurra Singh certainly did not raise it. Bossk had no particular interest in it. The moral weight of what had happened fell into a gap between the people involved and stayed there. Windu survived. He and Anakin Skywalker were trapped in the wreckage, injured but alive. Padme Amidala and Ahsoka Tano arrived in time to pull them out before the Endurance finished breaking apart. The plan failed at the last and most important step. What followed moved quickly. Aurra decided the situation had become too dangerous to hold. The group fled to Florum, a barren world in the Outer Rim controlled by Hondo Ohnaka's pirate operation. It was the kind of place where Republic law was more a concept than a practical reality, and where people who needed to disappear from official attention could do so for a while. They took hostages during the escape. This was Aurra's decision, and it tells you everything about the difference between her priorities and Boba's. For Aurra, the hostages were leverage, functional tools in a negotiation that might follow. For Boba, the operation had always been about one thing, and one thing only. Hostages were a complication. They were evidence that the plan had already drifted away from what he had set out to do. Plo Koon and Ahsoka tracked the group to Florum. The standoff that followed was tense and brief. Aura made clear she would execute the hostages if pressed. And then, when the situation turned against her completely, she did something that Boba would not forget for the rest of his life. She left him. No warning, no discussion. She took Slave Eye, his father's ship, the one he had grown up flying, the vessel that was the last physical connection to the life he had known on Kamino. And she went. Boba was left standing on Florum without transport, without his ship, without the woman who had presented herself as his guide through this. Hondo later described the expression on Boba's face at that moment as something he found difficult to characterize. Not surprise, exactly. Not the raw devastation of someone who had trusted completely and been proven wrong. Something quieter than that. Something that looked, Hondo said, like a person filing information away, learning something about the world that they suspected was true and had now confirmed. Boba was taken into custody shortly after. The journey to Coruscant was not long. Republic facilities processed him efficiently. He was young, but what he had done was documented clearly. The infiltration, the bomb, the deaths. The courts did not treat his age as irrelevance, but they did not ignore it either. He was convicted. He was sentenced. He was placed in a detention facility on Coruscant, the capital of the Republic he had tried to wound. The cell was small. The days were quiet. The planet outside the facility was enormous and bright and completely indifferent to one boy's story. Mace Windu was alive. The Endurance was destroyed. Jango's helmet was gone, lost somewhere in the wreckage of the plan. The ship was in Aura Singh's hands. The people Boba had aligned himself with had either abandoned him or were simply gone. He was 12 years old. He was alone. He had nothing left of his father except memory and training, and the name on the Republic's record of his conviction. What he did with the time in that cell, what he thought about, what he decided, what shape his intentions took in the silence of detention, is not something any account preserves. The record picks up again later, when the next chapter of his life began taking form. But somewhere in those months of confinement, surrounded by the Republic on all sides, Boba Fett was becoming something. The grief was still there. The promise made on the Geonosis sand had not expired. The loss had not softened. It had just gotten quieter, more patient. And in the criminal underworld, patience in someone young enough to have decades ahead of them is one of the most dangerous qualities there is. There is a dent in Boba Fett's helmet. It sits on the left side, just above the visor, small enough that you might miss it at first glance, deep enough that whatever caused it left a permanent mark in Mandalorian iron. Every image of Boba Fett from his adult years shows it in the same place. Every account of him from the Galactic Civil War era includes it. It became, over time, as recognizable as the helmet itself, part of the shape of the legend, part of what people pictured when they heard the name. Nobody in canon has ever explained where it came from. That silence is interesting on its own. Mandalorian armor gets damaged. That is part of what it is. A record of survival. Worn evidence of encounters that did not go the way they were supposed to. Dents and repairs and modifications accumulate over a lifetime of use. But most significant damage has a story attached to it, even if the story is brief. This one does not. The official record simply shows the dent present in every image from a certain point forward, with no explanation offered and no source claiming responsibility. In Legends, however, specifically in story material developed for the Clone Wars animated series that was never finished and never aired, there is an account, and the account involves Cad Bane. To understand why that matters, you need to understand who Cad Bane was. During the Clone Wars, the bounty hunting profession operated in a particular kind of ecosystem. The war created demand. Both sides needed things done that official military forces could not do cleanly. Intelligence gathered, targets removed, assets recovered. People moved across lines that official channels could not cross. Bounty hunters filled that space. They were useful precisely because they existed outside the formal structures of either the Republic or the Confederacy. They could be hired and discarded. They could operate in places where a Republic cruiser or a separatist fleet would trigger immediate response. Within that ecosystem, most hunters had a specialty. Some tracked, some extracted, some specialized in a particular species or a particular type of contract. The profession had its hierarchies and its reputations, and those reputations were maintained through track record. Contracts completed, targets delivered. The accumulated evidence of reliability in situations where reliability was worth significant payment. Cad Bane sat at the top of that hierarchy during the Clone Wars. There was no serious argument about it. He was Duros, blue-skinned, red-eyed, with a face that seemed designed to communicate absolute indifference to everything except the work in front of him. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and a long coat, and moved through the galaxy with the unhurried confidence of someone who had not been genuinely afraid in a very long time. His methods were precise and his results were consistent. He had operated against Jedi directly on multiple occasions and survived each time, which put him in a category of hunter so small it barely qualified as a category. He did not have principles. This is worth stating plainly, because it is sometimes confused with having a code. Cad Bane kept his contracts. He delivered what he promised. He did not betray clients mid-operation. But these were not moral commitments. They were professional standards maintained because a hunter who broke contracts lost future work. The distinction mattered. Jango Fett had spoken to Boba about honor as something real. For Bane, reliability was simply good business practice. The internal difference between those two positions was enormous, even when the external behavior looked similar. Bane treated violence as a craft. He was good at it the way a skilled engineer is good at building things. Not with passion, not with feeling, but with competence and attention to detail and a complete absence of the hesitation that gets people killed. He did not enjoy it particularly. He did not avoid it. It was the primary tool of his profession, and he used it accordingly. This was the man Boba Fett encountered after his release from the Coruscant detention facility. The exact circumstances of how they came together are not fully documented in canon. What the broader record suggests is that Boba, released from detention and without resources or allies, moved back toward the bounty-hunting world. That was the only environment he had been trained, for he was adolescent now, past the raw grief of the immediate post-geonosis period, shaped by 2 years of detention, carrying a set of skills that had no practical application outside the profession his father had prepared him for. Cad Bane was the best in that profession. For a young hunter trying to establish himself, proximity to Bane meant access to the highest level of the work. It also meant being evaluated constantly by someone who had no patience for weakness and no interest in sentiment. What the unfinished Clone Wars material describes, and this is the account that canon neither confirms nor contradicts, existing instead in that particular uncertain space of developed but unreleased material, is a confrontation between them that turned violent. The details vary slightly across different descriptions of the unfinished story, but the core is consistent. At some point in their association, Boba and Bane faced each other directly. Both drew, both fired, both were hit, both walked away. The dent in Boba's helmet in this account is where Bane's shot landed. The angle and the depth match what a direct blaster hit at close range would produce against Mandalorian iron. Enough force to leave a permanent mark, not enough to penetrate the material entirely. Boba survived because the armor held. The scar it left behind was the armor doing exactly what Mandalorian armor is designed to do. In the same exchange, Boba's shot hit Bane. He survived as well by similar margins. 2 hunters, 1 standoff, neither dead, both marked. Now here is where the contradiction becomes interesting. Canon does not include this event. The animated series was not completed. The story material exists in the form of concept art, production notes, and the accounts of people who worked on it. But it was never officially released as finished canon content, which means that in the current official record, the dent simply exists without explanation. It is there. Its origin is unaddressed. This creates an unusual situation. The physical evidence, the dent itself, is canon. It appears in canon sources consistently. But the explanation for that evidence exists only in Legends-adjacent material that was never finished or released. So what do you do with that? One position is to set the unfinished material aside entirely. Canon is canon. Unverified production material, however detailed, is not the same as released content. The dent remains unexplained, and the absence of explanation is simply a gap in the record. The other position is that the physical evidence demands some explanation, and the only explanation that exists, even in unfinished form, is the Bane confrontation. The dent did not appear by itself. Something caused it. The production material describing Bane as that cause was developed by people with direct knowledge of the characters and the story. Dismissing it entirely because it was never aired seems to discard real information for procedural reasons. Neither position resolves the contradiction. Both are defensible. The record holds both simultaneously and does not choose between them. That tension, canon silence on one side, Legends adjacent detail on the other, is not unique to this specific moment in Boba's history. It will appear again. It is worth recognizing it here in this relatively contained example, before it becomes more complicated in later chapters. But set the textual question aside for a moment. Even if the confrontation happened exactly as the unfinished material describes, a larger question follows. What did Boba take from his time with Cad Bane? Bane was the best technical hunter of his era. If you wanted to learn how the profession operated at its highest level, how to read a contract, how to assess a target, how to plan an operation that accounted for variables most hunters overlooked, being near Bane meant learning from the best available source. That education was real, and Boba absorbed it. His adult operational style shows evidence of exactly this kind of precision. The patience, the attention to approach angles and extraction routes, the discipline of not moving until conditions were right. These qualities do not develop in isolation. They are learned from someone who already has them. Bane was that someone, but here is what the evidence suggests Boba did not take. Bane's relationship to the people around him was entirely functional. Allies were tools. Contracts defined obligation. The moment a relationship stopped serving a professional purpose, it ended without remainder. Bane did not carry people with him. He did not accumulate attachments. He moved through the world cleanly, leaving nothing behind him that could be used as leverage or as a wound. Boba's adult record does not look like that. It looks like someone who absorbed the technical discipline and then spent decades trying to figure out what to do with everything else. The parts of himself that Bane's model had no room for, the grief, the loyalty instincts, the particular way he responded to betrayal, did not disappear because he was near someone who had excised equivalent qualities from himself. They persisted. They shaped his choices in ways that pure mercenary logic would not have produced. The refusal to take certain contracts, the specific targets he accepted, and the specific ones he declined without public explanation. The way his name accumulated a reputation for reliability that went slightly beyond what simple professionalism required. A quality that other hunters noticed and commented on. A sense that Boba Fett kept his word in a way that suggested the word meant something to him personally. rather than just professionally. Django's lessons had gone somewhere that Bane's training could not reach and could not overwrite. Aura Singh's lesson had gone somewhere too, but it was a different kind of lesson. What Aura demonstrated, first by taking Slave Eye when the Florum situation collapsed, then by the broader pattern of her behavior throughout their association, was that the people who present themselves as allies in the criminal underworld are almost always operating from self-interest first. The care she showed Boba was real enough in a surface sense. She fed him, she taught him, she gave him access to resources and knowledge he needed. But the care had a ceiling, and when the cost of maintaining it rose above a certain level, she crossed that ceiling without looking back. Boba learned this. He filed it the way Hondo had described, quietly, without visible reaction, the way you store information that is painful but useful. The result was a particular kind of self-sufficiency that ran through everything he did afterward. He worked with people when the work required it. He maintained professional relationships. He was not incapable of alliance, but the inner distance Hondo had noticed on Florum never closed. The part of himself that he kept back from Aura, from Bosk, from Bane, that part stayed back from almost everyone for the rest of his life. This is not the same as being empty. It is closer to being protected. The difference matters because it tells you something about what was still alive inside him, that he did not want exposed to the specific kind of damage that exposure had already caused him. By the end of his adolescence, Boba Fett had been educated by 3 distinct teachers. Django had given him the foundation, the technical skills, the Mandalorian framework, the sense that honor and reliability were real values rather than convenient fictions. That foundation held even when everything built on top of it was stripped away. Aura had given him a lesson he did not ask for, that care has conditions, and the conditions are not always stated in advance. He learned to account for that, to not be surprised by it. Bane had given him the highest level technical education available in the profession, and the model of a hunter who had completely solved the problem of attachment by eliminating it. Boba absorbed the technique. He did not adopt the solution. What emerged from those 3 educations was something that fit none of the 3 models cleanly. Not Django's son. Exactly. That version of his life had ended in the Geonosis arena. Not Aura's student. That association had closed on Florum. Not Bane's apprentice. The dent in the helmet, if the unfinished account is accurate, marked the point where that relationship resolved itself into something mutual and equal rather than instructional. Something else, something that did not have a clear name yet in the wider galaxy, though the galaxy would eventually supply one. For now, he was a young man with a specific set of skills and a specific internal architecture that none of his teachers had designed and none of them had fully understood. He was, in that sense, exactly what Django had asked the Kaminoans to produce all those years ago, unaltered, unmodified, shaped entirely by what had happened to him. The galaxy had not been gentle with what it produced, but the thing it produced was real, in a way that the 3 million conditioned soldiers from the same facility never quite were. Other figures in Star Wars history found themselves in similar positions, shaped by powerful forces they did not choose, carrying legacies they had not asked for, trying to build something coherent from what remained. Some of them broke under the weight. Some became what the forces around them had designed them to become. Some found a third option that nobody around them had anticipated. What each of those paths cost is worth examining, because the path that Boba eventually walked was not inevitable. The choices he made in the decades ahead were real choices, made by someone capable of choosing otherwise. To understand why those choices looked the way they did, it helps to look at the others who faced the same crossroads. What it cost them tells you something about what it cost him. Boba Fett was not the only one. That is easy to forget when you focus on his story specifically. His circumstances were unusual enough. The unaltered clone, the dead father, the child trained for a profession most adults found difficult to survive. That it feels like something singular. Something that belongs only to him. But the galaxy has a long history of producing people who did not choose what they were made into. It happened before Boba. It happened during his lifetime. It happened to people who shared his face, and people who shared nothing with him, except the fundamental experience of being shaped by forces that did not ask their permission first. And looking at those other people, what they became, what they fought against, what they eventually accepted or rejected, tells you something about Boba that his own record does not always make clear. Because the question is not just what was done to him. The question is what he did with it. And to understand that, you need to see the full range of what was possible. You need to see the people who made different choices, or who had no choice at all, or who discovered too late that the thing they thought was a choice had already been made for them. Start with the ones who shared his face. Rex was born in the same facility as Boba Fett. Not on the same day, not in the same tank, not under the same conditions, but on Camino, from the same genetic source, in the same years. He grew at twice the natural rate, aged artificially the way all the clone troopers were aged, moved through an accelerated development program designed to produce a functional soldier in roughly half the time nature would have required. By the time Rex was leading men in battle, he was biologically in his 20s, but had existed for only about a decade. The behavioral conditioning shaped everything about how he understood himself. Not as brainwashing in a crude sense. The Kaminoans were more sophisticated than that. It was structural. It was woven into the development process from the earliest stages, shaping the way Rex processed loyalty, authority, and identity before he had the developmental foundation to evaluate those things independently. He was built to serve. Not cruelly, not without care for his well-being, but fundamentally, at the level of who he was built to fit inside a command structure and function effectively within it. And Rex was exceptional within that structure. He was thoughtful for a clone. He asked questions that other troopers did not ask. He developed genuine relationships with Anakin Skywalker, with Ahsoka Tano, with the men under his command. He had a personality that went beyond what the conditioning strictly required. He was, in the language the Jedi sometimes used, more than what he had been designed to be. But the conditioning was still there. When Order 66 was transmitted, the command embedded in every clone trooper at a neurological level, designed to override conscious decision-making and trigger the execution of Jedi officers. Most clones followed it without hesitation. Rex fought it. He had enough awareness of what was happening to resist long enough to warn Ahsoka before the override took full effect. That resistance was extraordinary. It was also the limit of what was possible against something built into him before he had any say in the matter. He survived the Clone Wars. He lived for decades after, but he spent those decades carrying the knowledge of what had been put inside him without his consent, and what it had made him do before he could stop it. Wolf, another clone commander, followed a similar arc. Aware enough to struggle, conditioned deeply enough that the struggle was never fully resolved. Now hold that against Boba. No conditioning, no override command sitting dormant in his nervous system, no accelerated development that compressed his formation into half the natural time. He was given the same raw material as Rex and Wolf and 3 million others, and then left alone to develop at a natural pace in whatever direction his experiences pushed him. The absence of conditioning is usually discussed as an advantage. And in certain obvious ways it was. Boba could make choices that his genetic brothers could not make. He was not subject to commands that bypassed his conscious mind. He was, in the most basic sense, freer. But freedom is not the same as ease. The clone troopers had a structure. They had a clear sense of purpose built into them from the beginning. They knew what they were for. They knew where they fit. The conditioning that limited them also, in a specific and real way, held them, gave them a shape, told them who they were before they were old enough to ask the question themselves. Boba had none of that. He had a father who was killed before the transmission was complete. He had skills and the beginning of a framework, and then a sudden, violent absence where the rest of the framework should have been. He was free in the way that a building is free, when you remove its structural supports, capable of going in any direction, including straight down. That distinction matters. It is easy to look at the clone trooper's conditioning and see only a cage. But for someone developing without any structure at all, the cage at least told you where the walls were. Darth Maul's story begins earlier and goes deeper. He was taken from Dathomir as a very young child, so young that the accounts of whether he had any real memories of his mother or his home world before being taken differ across different tellings. His mother was a Night Sister, a member of a culture with its own relationship to the dark side of the Force. She gave him to Darth Sidious, the Sith Lord who was building his plan toward galactic domination. Across decades of careful preparation, Sidious did not raise Maul as a son in any meaningful sense. He raised him as a weapon. The training was brutal, designed to produce a being of pure darkness. A killer whose connection to the Force had been twisted entirely toward violence and hatred. Maul was taught that he was an instrument of Sith revenge, that his purpose was defined by his master's agenda, that his entire existence justified itself through what he was able to destroy. He believed this completely for the first part of his life. There was nothing else offered. Then he was cut in half by Obi-Wan Kenobi on Naboo, left for dead, and spent the next decade in a wreckage of physical and psychological disintegration on a junk world called Lotho Minor. The instrument had been discarded when it broke. The identity built entirely around being useful to Sidious had no function. Once Sidious believed the tool was destroyed, what survived was something that Sidious's training had not accounted for. Raw instinct, a core of self that the conditioning had not fully reached. Not healthy. Maul during those years was not healthy in any recognizable sense, but present, still there, still capable of clawing back toward something. When Savage Opress found him and Mother Talzin restored his mind and body, Maul spent years trying to figure out what he actually was beneath the weapon he had been constructed to be. He built criminal organizations. He sought revenge on Kenobi. He tried to reclaim a sense of purpose that was his own, rather than inherited from a master who had thrown him away. He mostly failed. The early construction was too deep. The identity had been installed before there was enough of a self present to resist it. Every time Maul tried to define himself independently, he kept circling back to the same gravitational centers, Sidious, Kenobi, the Sith legacy, because those were the only coordinates the map of his inner life contained. He died on Tatooine, in the desert, killed by the same man he had spent decades trying to reach. It was, by any measure, a life defined almost entirely by what had been done to it, rather than by what it had chosen. The contrast with Boba is instructive, but it requires care. Both were shaped early by powerful forces they did not consent to. Both lost the primary figure in their formation before the process was complete. Both spent years operating in spaces of violence and danger, building reputations around what they were capable of destroying. But Maul's conditioning was total in a way that Boba's was not. The Sith training had no gaps. It did not leave room for the kind of internal distance that Hondo had noticed in Boba on Florum. The part of himself held back, kept private, never entirely given over to the people or systems around him. Maul was not given that option. His formation had been deliberately designed to occupy every available space. Boba's had not. Whatever Jango intended, the design was incomplete at the point of his death. The foundation was there. The superstructure was not. And in that incompleteness, there was room for something that Maul never quite had. The question of what Boba did with that room is the investigation's central question, and this chapter will not answer it. But the comparison makes the room visible. You can see it clearly when you place his history next to Maul's. The space where something could have grown that did not exist in the other man's story at all. Jacen Solo chose. That is the element that makes his story different from both Maul's and Boba's, and also the element that makes it the most uncomfortable of the three parallels. In Legend's continuity, which runs parallel to the canon timeline, and tells the story of what happened to the Skywalker family in the decades after the Galactic Civil War. Jacen Solo was the son of Han Solo and Leia Organa. He was Force-sensitive from birth, trained by his uncle Luke Skywalker, and regarded by many in the new Jedi Order as one of the most gifted and promising students of his generation. He had advantages that Boba and Maul never had: a stable family, parents who loved him, access to the best Jedi training available. He was not shaped by violence from the beginning. He was not designed as a weapon. Nobody took him from his home and built something specific out of him. And then he became Darth Caedus anyway. The process was long and documented in considerable detail across multiple Legends novels. He was captured and tortured by the Yuuzhan Vong during their invasion. He spent years afterward searching for a philosophical framework that could make sense of what he had experienced. He encountered a Sith teaching that offered him exactly that framework: a justification, a purpose, a way of understanding suffering that positioned it as a tool for a greater goal, rather than simply something that had happened to him. He chose to follow that path, step by step, over years, with full awareness at each stage of what he was moving toward. He was not conditioned. He was not broken the way Maul had been broken. He looked at the available options and made a decision. The decision destroyed him. He became one of the most dangerous figures in the post-Imperial galaxy, killed people who loved him, and died at the hands of his own twin sister. What makes Jacen relevant here is not the darkness of the outcome. It is the mechanism. He had more freedom than almost anyone in this parallel. More resources, more stability, more people who cared about what happened to him. And he used that freedom to become what everyone had feared he might become. The fear itself, in some accounts, contributed to the outcome. He was told often enough in various ways that his power made him dangerous. At some point he seems to have decided to stop fighting the narrative. Now place all three alongside Boba, Rex and Wolf, conditioned from the beginning, shaped by design, capable of resistance, but always fighting against something built into them, at a level deeper than conscious choice. They did not have the option of becoming something entirely different. The structure was inside them. Maul, formed early by total conditioning, lost before anything underneath could fully develop, spent his adult life trying to excavate a self from beneath the weapon, and mostly finding only more weapon. Jacen, given every advantage, every resource, every alternative, and chose the darkness anyway. Freedom used against itself. Boba sits in the middle of this triangle, without fitting cleanly into any corner of it. He had more freedom than Rex. He had more of himself intact than Maul. He did not make Jacen's deliberate turn. He came out of his formation incomplete and damaged and equipped with skills that only functioned in violent contexts, and he built a life from those materials without anyone's guidance or anyone's design. Whether what he built was good, whether it was coherent, whether it was chosen, whether the man inside the armor was someone who understood himself, is the question the investigation keeps returning to. What the parallels confirm is this: it was possible to do much worse with what Boba had been given. Several people did. And it was also possible to do better, or at least differently, if the circumstances had been different. The circumstances were not different. He was given what he was given. In the sequence it arrived, with the gaps and the losses exactly where they fell. Every figure in this parallel either broke under the weight of what was assigned to them, was consumed by it completely, or found something underneath it that the assignment had not anticipated. Maul broke. Jason was consumed. Rex found something underneath, but spent decades uncertain what that something was worth, or whether it had arrived too late to matter. Boba found something underneath too. What it looked like, who witnessed it, and what they said about what they saw, is what the next part of this investigation turns toward. Everyone who ever spent time near Boba Fett remembered what he did. Nobody remembered what he said. That pattern runs through every account, every testimony, every second-hand description that survives from people who encountered him across the decades of his career. The behavior is documented in detail. The words, when they appear at all, are brief, functional, stripped of anything that might reveal what was happening behind them. And the inner life, the thing that would tell you who the man actually was beneath the work he was doing, is simply absent from the record. This could mean different things. It could mean Boba Fett was genuinely opaque, that there was no inner life visible because there was none to see. It could mean the witnesses were not looking for it, focused instead on the parts of him that were immediately relevant to their own situations. It could mean he was very good at presenting exactly what he chose to present, and nothing else. The accounts themselves do not resolve this question, but they are worth examining carefully, because the pattern of what they include and what they omit is itself a kind of evidence. Start with Han Solo, because Solo is the witness most people reach for first, and his account is the one that requires the most careful handling. Han Solo's relationship to Boba Fett was defined almost entirely by fear, and fear is a poor lens for accurate observation. This is not a criticism of Solo specifically. Fear distorts perception in predictable ways. It narrows focus, heightens attention to threat indicators, and filters out information that does not bear directly on the perceived danger. Someone genuinely afraid of another person tends to remember them as larger, more capable, and more defined than they actually were. The emotional intensity of the experience writes itself over the details. Solo encountered Boba Fett at multiple points. The most documented of these is the period surrounding the Imperial pursuit of the Millennium Falcon following the Battle of Hoth, culminating in the events on Bespin and Solo's carbonite freezing. This sequence is well recorded because multiple witnesses were present, and the outcome was significant enough to generate documentation from several directions simultaneously. What Solo's accounts from this period actually contain is surprisingly thin on description of Boba himself. He noted the ship. The slave I had a profile that was difficult to miss and harder to lose, and Solo spent considerable energy during the Hoth pursuit, trying to break contact with it. He noted the presence at Bespin. Boba had arrived ahead of him, had already made arrangements with Lando Calrissian, had positioned the situation so that Solo arrived into a trap that was already fully set. He noted the efficiency of it, the absence of wasted movement. But what Solo actually observed about Boba Fett as a person, what the man looked like, how he moved, whether he spoke during the Bespin encounter, and what he said, occupies very little of the record. Solo's attention during those events was understandably elsewhere. He was managing the immediate crisis, calculating options, trying to protect the people around him. Boba was part of the environment of that crisis rather than its center from Solo's perspective. The most telling detail in Solo's accounts is actually an absence. He did not describe Boba as angry or hungry or personally invested in the outcome. He described him as functional, present, operating. The same language you might use to describe a piece of machinery that was doing its job correctly. Whether that machinery had anything running inside it that Solo simply did not see. Whether the calm exterior reflected something real or something performed is a question Solo's accounts cannot answer, because Solo was never looking for the answer. Leia Organa's perspective from the same period is sharper in some ways and more limited in others. Leia was a trained observer. Her years in the Senate and the rebellion had given her practice at reading people in high-pressure situations, at noticing what someone's behavior communicated about their intentions and priorities, even when their words were minimal or absent. She paid attention to people in ways that Solo did not always manage. Her observations of Boba Fett during the Bespin period are therefore worth more per sentence than Solo's, because she was actually looking. What she recorded was stillness, not the stillness of someone suppressing visible emotion. Leia knew what that looked like, had practiced it herself in Imperial custody. Something different. A quality of being completely present in a situation, without appearing personally involved in its outcome. Boba moved when movement was required. He was positioned correctly before situations required repositioning. He responded to developments without the slight delay that most people show when something unexpected occurs. The half-second of recalibration that the nervous system needs before the body acts. Leia noted this quality without naming it directly. She described it as unsettling, in a way that was different from how most dangerous people were unsettling. Most dangerous people communicated their danger. There was usually something in the way they moved or held themselves that made the threat visible. Boba communicated nothing in that register. The unsettling quality came precisely from the absence of signal. What she did not record was any observation of interiority. She watched him work. She did not observe anything that suggested she saw through the work to whatever was beneath it. Either nothing was visible, or she was not positioned to see it, or she saw something and did not think it worth noting. The omission does not tell us which of those three explanations is correct. It simply leaves the question open. Dengar's account is different in kind from anything Solo or Leia produced, and it requires a different kind of attention. In Legend's continuity, Dengar was a veteran bounty hunter who encountered Boba Fett in the aftermath of the Sarlacc. The circumstances were unusual. Boba had emerged from the creature damaged, without his armor, in a condition that would have been fatal for most people, and was nearly fatal for him. Dengar found him in the Tatooine desert, and, depending on which version of the account you follow, either assisted his recovery directly or encountered him during the early stages of it. Either way, the two spent extended time together during a period when Boba was not operational, not working, not maintaining the persona that the rest of the galaxy knew, recovering, slowly, from something that should have been unsurvivable. Dengar's account of this period is the most detailed description of Boba Fett as a person that the Legends record contains. It is also the most contested. Dengar was not a neutral observer. He owed Boba professional debts from prior interactions. He admired him in a way that was real, but that colored his descriptions in the direction of a more impressive subject. He was also, by every available measure, a storyteller who understood that a better story was worth more than a precise one in the circles where such things were traded. With all of that noted, some elements of his account have a consistency and specificity that suggest they reflect something real rather than something constructed. He described a man who did not speak much during recovery, but who, when he did speak, was direct to the point of discomfort. Not aggressive, but simply unwilling to add words that served no function. He described a specific incident where Boba, still physically limited, assessed a tactical situation with complete accuracy and communicated the assessment in approximately 4 sentences, then waited in silence while Dengar processed the information. The patience in that waiting, Dengar said, was not tense. It was simply patience. The kind that comes from someone who has learned that most things arrive eventually, if you do not rush them. He described Boba's relationship to the Mandalorian armor, once it was recovered, as something that went beyond professional equipment. Not reverence, exactly. Not the way you might treat a sacred object. More like the way someone handles something that belongs to them in a fundamental sense. That it was not separate from him in the way his other equipment was separate from him. And he described something else. Something he said he was not sure how to characterize. And that he offered with more uncertainty than the rest of his account. He said that, during the recovery period, in the quieter moments, there was occasionally something in Boba's manner that suggested he was carrying something he had not put down, not an injury, not the physical damage from the Sarlacc, something older, something that had been there longer than any of the recent events. Dengar did not speculate about what it was. He noted it and moved on. Because he understood, he said, that some questions you do not ask the person you are asking about. That restraint is perhaps the most credible thing in his entire account. Fennec Shand, observed Boba Fett at a point in his life that none of the other witnesses reached. Their association began in the years after the fall of the Empire, on Tatooine, under circumstances that involved Fennec near death in the desert, and Boba making a decision to intervene rather than pass by. She was a skilled assassin with her own significant reputation, someone operating at a high professional level who had no particular reason to feel gratitude toward anyone and who had learned, through her own version of the same hard education, not to let gratitude interfere with clear thinking. What she observed over the years of their work together was not a bounty hunter. That distinction deserves to sit for a moment, because it is the sharpest observation in all the witness accounts this chapter has examined. The others saw a bounty hunter. They saw someone operating in the profession his father had built, using the skills his various teachers had refined, maintaining the reputation that the galaxy had assembled around him over decades. They saw the function. Fennec saw something else. She saw a man who was finished with the function. Not finished in a defeated sense. Not someone who had run out of capacity or lost his edge. Finished in the way that a person is finished, with a chapter of their life that served its purpose and no longer needs to continue. The bounty hunting had been what was available to him. It had used his skills. It had kept him operational through circumstances that would have ended most people. But it had never, by any evidence she could identify, been what he was actually for. What he was actually for, in the years she knew him, looked like something different. It looked like wanting a place, wanting something stable that was his, and that would persist beyond any individual contract or operation. The word she returned to, in describing his stated intentions for the Tatooine period, was respect. Not fear. He had fear in abundance, had operated in the currency of fear for 30 years, and knew exactly what it was worth and what it cost. Respect was something different, something that required being seen as a person rather than as a threat. The distinction between fear and respect is not obvious from the outside. Both produce similar behavior in the people who feel them. But the person being feared and the person being respected experience their positions very differently. Boba had spent decades in the first category. Fennec's account suggests he understood the difference and wanted the second. Whether that desire was always present and previously suppressed, or whether it emerged from specific experiences in the years between the Sarlacc and their association is something her account does not resolve. She was not the kind of person who asked those questions directly. Neither was he the kind of person who would have answered them if she had. Set all 4 accounts side by side and the pattern becomes visible. Solo described behavior, threat assessment behavior, avoidance behavior. The behavior of someone operating with complete efficiency in a specific professional context. The inner state behind the behavior did not appear in his record, because Solo was not looking at the inner state. He was looking at the threat. Leia described behavior. Precise, economical, technically accomplished behavior that communicated nothing about motivation or feeling. She noted the quality of the stillness without being able to identify what the stillness was covering, or whether it was covering anything at all. Dengar described behavior, and then, in the specific and hesitant observation about something being carried, reached slightly past it. Got close enough to the edge of the inner life to notice its existence, without being able to describe its contents. His account is the most valuable for this investigation, precisely because of that moment of honest uncertainty. Fennec described behavior, and then also reached past it, but in a different direction. Not toward what Boba was carrying from the past, but toward what he was building for the future. Her observation about respect versus fear is the clearest statement any witness made about his inner life, and it came not from direct conversation, but from extended observation of his choices and priorities over time. None of these accounts contradict each other. That is notable. 4 different people, coming from 4 different angles, across 4 different periods of his life, and their descriptions are consistent. The behavior matches across all of them. The stillness is there in all of them. The economy of language and movement is there in all of them. What is also consistent is the limit of each account. Every witness saw exactly as far as Boba allowed them to see. No further. That is either a coincidence of limited observation across 4 separate people, or it is a description of someone who was, throughout his entire adult life, precisely as present as he needed to be, and nothing more. A quality that precise does not arrive accidentally. It is either built in from somewhere, or it is chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, across decades of practice. The next question is which one it was. Legends are not accidents. They do not grow on their own, the way grass grows in an empty field. They are cultivated, maintained, fed specific information and starved of other information, shaped over time by people who understand exactly what a useful legend is worth, and exactly what it costs to keep one alive. The legend of Boba Fett was one of the most carefully maintained reputations in the criminal and military underworld of the Imperial era. By the time of the Galactic Civil War, his name produced a specific response in people who heard it. A combination of recognition and unease that most bounty hunters spent entire careers working toward and never achieved. Clients paid more for him than for anyone else. Targets ran differently when they learned he was the one tracking them. Other hunters adjusted their behavior when his name appeared in connection with a contract. This did not happen because the man was extraordinary, though he was skilled. It happened because several very powerful people found it useful for it to happen, and they invested accordingly. Understanding who those people were, and what they were building the legend to accomplish, is the only way to separate what Boba Fett actually was from what the galaxy was told he was. Those are not the same thing. They were never the same thing. And the gap between them is larger than most accounts of his life have acknowledged. Darth Vader assembled 6 bounty hunters on the bridge of the Executor above the Hoth asteroid field. The scene is documented. The commission was specific. Find the Millennium Falcon. Deliver Han Solo intact. No disintegrations. The hunters assembled were a varied group. Dengar, IG-88, Bosk, Zuckuss, Forlom and Boba Fett. 6 professionals given the same brief, sent in the same direction. Vader gave Boba Fett one additional sentence that he did not give the others. No disintegrations. That specific warning, delivered to one hunter and not the rest, tells you something about what Vader understood the reputation to mean. He was not warning Boba because disintegration was Boba's preferred method. He was warning him because the reputation had grown large enough that a Sith Lord felt it necessary to set parameters on it before the operation began. The warning was itself a kind of acknowledgement. It said, "I know what you are capable of, and I need you to limit yourself for this particular job." The other 5 hunters received no such acknowledgement. They were professionals being given a commission. Boba was something slightly different. Someone whose capabilities were understood to require management rather than simple direction. Vader did not arrive at that understanding by accident. He had worked with Boba Fett before. The Imperial records from the period between the formation of the Empire and the Battle of Yavin contain multiple references to contracted work involving Fett, specific operations, specific targets, specific outcomes that required a level of discretion and reliability that standard Imperial instruments could not provide. The details of many of these operations remain classified or simply absent from surviving records. What is consistent is the pattern of employment. Difficult targets, sensitive circumstances, outcomes that the Empire needed without wanting to be seen needing them. Vader understood the value of a weapon that did not wear an Imperial uniform. A bounty hunter operated outside the chain of command. He could be deployed in situations where official Imperial action would have created political complications. He could be discarded, if necessary, in ways that a stormtrooper could not. And if he carried a reputation terrifying, enough that targets responded to the name before the man arrived, the operational efficiency gained was considerable. Vader used all of this deliberately, and in using it, he fed it. Every contract fulfilled under Vader's commission added to the record. Every target found, every outcome delivered with the precision that Vader's standards required, became another entry in the documentation of what Boba Fett was capable of. The Empire's records were not neutral observations. They were produced by an institution with specific interests in how its contractors were perceived. A contractor who was documented as extraordinarily capable was more useful than a contractor who was simply adequate. The documentation served the Empire's operational purposes. The man himself had limited ability to correct it, and no particular incentive to try. Jabba the Hutt's relationship to the Fett legend operated differently, but served a complementary purpose. Jabba was among the most powerful crime lords in the Outer Rim during the Imperial era, maintaining an organization that extended across multiple star systems and operated in the spaces that Imperial law either could not reach or chose to ignore. His palace on Tatooine functioned as a court, a place where power was demonstrated through display, where reputation was currency, where the people in your employ communicated something about your own status. Having Boba Fett available was a statement, not just a practical asset, though the practical value was real. Having the most feared bounty hunter in the known galaxy available for personal commissions told every other criminal organization, every rival power, every debtor considering default, exactly what category of response was available to Jabba if he chose to use it. He did not need to deploy Boba frequently. The availability itself was the message. Jabba therefore had strong incentives to maintain and amplify whatever the existing reputation contained. Stories about Boba's capabilities circulated through criminal networks in ways that Jabba's organization could influence. Accounts of outcomes, the ones that reached the right ears, the ones that moved through smuggling routes and cantina conversations, and the informal, Communication channels that connected the Outer Rim's criminal infrastructure were not simply reported. They were curated. This curation was not sophisticated propaganda in any formal sense. It was simpler than that. Certain stories were repeated. Others were allowed to fade. The version of events that made Boba Fett sound more dangerous was more useful to Jabba than the version that complicated the picture. Over years, this process produced a reputation that had drifted considerably from the documented record of what the man had actually done. In Legends, the Mimban campaign references offer one of the clearest examples of how this drift operated. The details of Boba Fett's involvement in operations connected to the Mimban period, a conflict in the Outer Rim that intersected with both Imperial, military action and criminal network interests, are fragmentary and partially contradictory. What the Legends record suggests is that certain outcomes attributed to Boba during this period were exaggerated in the retelling, amplified by parties who found the amplified version more useful than the accurate one. The body counts attached to specific operations grew between first account and later repetition. The circumstances of particular captures became more dramatic in each iteration. The margin by which Boba Fett was described as operating above ordinary professional capacity widened with each retelling. None of this was necessarily deliberate falsification in any single instance. The mechanism of legend amplification does not require coordinated dishonesty. It requires only that the people repeating stories have incentives to select the more impressive version, and that there is no competing institution invested in providing correction. The Empire had no interest in accurate accounting of its contractors. Jabba had no interest in deflating a reputation he was using. Other bounty hunters had their own incentives. A galaxy that believed Boba Fett was nearly untouchable discouraged competition for the contracts he preferred. The accurate record had no natural advocate, so it contracted, slowly, over years until what remained in wide circulation was a legend rather than a history. Now examine what the legend concealed. The contracts that Boba Fett refused are not in the official record. Contracts are documented when they are accepted and completed. A hunter's decision to decline a commission leaves almost no trace in surviving records. No entry, no explanation, no evidence that the conversation happened. The silence in the record reads as absence rather than choice. But the pattern of absences, when examined carefully, tells a different story. During the Imperial period, certain categories of targets appear consistently in the commissions that flowed toward high-level bounty hunters. Fugitives from Imperial justice, political dissidents, rebel-affiliated operatives, people whose capture or elimination served Imperial ideological purposes as much as practical ones. These contracts were well-funded. They were the kind of work that a hunter building a reputation would logically have pursued aggressively. Boba Fett's record of Imperial-era work shows a pattern of engagement with high-value criminal targets and a relative absence of the ideological work. The distinction is subtle enough that it did not apparently draw significant attention during the period itself, and it would be too strong to say that he refused this category of work categorically. The record is incomplete enough that such a claim cannot be supported. What can be said is that the contracts he is documented as completing skew consistently toward the criminal and the practical, and away from the political and ideological. For a hunter who needed Vader's endorsement to maintain his position at the top of the profession, this pattern required management. It was not invisible to Vader, who was not a person who missed operational patterns in people he employed. What it suggests is that Boba Fett was not available for all uses that his employers might have preferred. That there were limits to the instrument, limits that were neither announced nor explained, and that the instrument maintained those limits quietly across years of work at the highest levels of an empire that did not encourage limits in anything it employed. The myth did not contain this information. The myth contained only the outcomes, the targets found, the commissions completed, the reputation for reliability that made the name worth what it cost. The nuance beneath those outcomes was not part of what the myth was built to communicate. Other hunters noticed things that the official record did not contain. The bounty hunting community during the imperial era was small enough at its upper levels that reputations were formed partly through direct observation rather than second-hand account. Hunters worked in proximity. They competed for contracts. They occasionally encountered each other in operational contexts where behavior could be observed rather than simply reported. Several accounts from this period, most of them in Legends material, some recoverable from canon-adjacent sources, describe a quality in Boba's professional relationships that did not fit the pure mercenary model the legend promoted. He kept track of debts, not financial debts specifically, though those too, but the broader category of obligation and reciprocity that exists in any professional community operating outside legal frameworks. If another hunter provided assistance in a difficult situation, that assistance was remembered and eventually returned. If a hunter crossed a line that the community recognized as a line, betraying a client, harming an uninvolved party unnecessarily, violating the informal protocols that kept the profession functional, Boba's response was noted as more consistent and more principled than the response of someone motivated purely by self-interest. This quality is difficult to reconcile with the myth. The myth required a figure who was beyond personal investment, who operated in pure professional detachment, who had no stake in outcomes beyond the contracted one. What the community observations suggest is something more complicated. Someone who maintained a personal code that was not the same as the contracted obligation, and who enforced that code in ways that the contractual framework did not require. Where that code came from, whether it traced to Django's lessons on Camino, or to something that developed independently in the years of damage and recovery, or to something else entirely, the accounts do not say. They simply note that it was there, and that it was inconsistent with the reputation that surrounded it. The empire fell at Endor. The institutions that had maintained the architecture of the Boba Fett legend, the imperial military structure, Jabba's criminal network, the specific ecosystem of imperial-era bounty hunting that had given the reputation, its shape and its value, collapsed or transformed within a short period. Jabba had already been dead for a year. The imperial command structure that had employed Boba and documented his work was dissolving into competing successor factions. The criminal underworld was reorganizing around new power centers that had not been built on the same foundations. The legend did not immediately disappear. Reputations built over decades do not dissolve with the institutions that maintained them. The name still meant something. Other hunters still adjusted their behavior when it appeared. Clients from the old network still knew what they were paying for. But the architecture that had built the legend, the powerful employers with strong incentives to amplify specific qualities and suppress others, the institutional documentation that fed the record in curated directions, the ecosystem that rewarded the myth because the myth served specific operational purposes, that architecture was gone. What remained was the man, without the machinery of construction around him, without Vader's commissions adding to the record, and Jabba's network shaping the circulation of stories. The gap between the legend and the person became more visible, not to the wider galaxy, which continued operating largely on the reputation it had inherited, but to Boba himself, presumably. and to anyone who observed him closely in the years that followed. The next chapter examines what happened when the architecture was removed, what the desert returned, what the man who had been built into a myth looked like when the building was done and he was standing in the ruins of it, with nothing but himself left to work with. The Sarlacc does not kill quickly, that is the point of it, the creature that lives beneath the sands of the Tatooine desert. In the depression known as the Great Pit of Carkoon, in the Dune Sea west of Mos Eisley, is not a predator in any conventional sense. It does not chase, it does not strike. It sits in one place for centuries and waits for things to fall into it, and when they do, it begins a process of digestion that takes approximately 1,000 years to complete. The experience of being inside the Sarlacc, according to the limited accounts that exist from people who fell in and survived long enough to describe anything, is not unconsciousness. The creature keeps its prey alive, aware, capable of experiencing what is being done to them for as long as the biology allows. It is, in the clinical language of the few xenobiological records that address it, a remarkably efficient system for extending the duration of a meal. Most things that enter the Sarlacc do not come back out. Boba Fett came back out. How long he was inside is not precisely recorded. The battle at the Pit of Carkoon, the operation to rescue Han Solo from Jabba the Hutt's custody that ended with Jabba dead, his sail barge destroyed, and several of his associates dead or scattered, took place in 4A. The timeline of what followed for Boba, specifically, is one of the least documented sequences in his entire history. The canon record does not give exact dates. It shows him emerging, at some point after the battle, from the desert, changed, damaged, alive. What happened in between is the question this chapter holds. The Sarlacc's biology has been documented in varying levels of detail across both canon and legends sources. The creature is partially subterranean, its main body anchored beneath the sand with only the beak and the surrounding tentacles visible above the surface. Its digestive system is distributed through a network of internal structures that extend deep into the ground. Prey is moved inward gradually, held in place by physical and chemical mechanisms that prevent escape while maintaining biological function. In legends, additional detail was provided about the Sarlacc's internal environment. The creature was described as having a degree of neural connectivity with the organisms inside it. A system that, whether by design or simply by the mechanics of extended proximity, created something resembling shared consciousness between the creature and its trapped prey. Other beings absorbed over the Sarlacc's long lifespan were described as still present in some form, their identities partially preserved within the creature's extended digestive process. The legend's account of Boba's survival draws on this biology. He used his Mandalorian armor, which had not been removed before he fell, as protection against the creature's digestive mechanisms. The armor bought time, not comfort, not safety, but time. Enough time to use tools still on his person to damage the creature from inside and create conditions for emergence. Canon does not provide this level of detail. What canon confirms is the result. He emerged. The armor was damaged in ways consistent with extended exposure to conditions that should have been fatal. His body carried injuries that persisted for the years that followed. The survival itself is the canon fact. The mechanism remains less fully documented. What both accounts agree on is this: whatever was inside the Sarlacc for that period, whatever experience accumulated in that darkness, it was not nothing. It was not a blank interval between falling in and walking out. Something happened in there that the record cannot contain, because no external observer was present, and Boba Fett did not describe it to anyone whose description survived. The marks it left on his body were visible for years afterward. The marks it left on everything else are harder to see, but they are there too. He emerged into the Tatooine desert without his armor. This is a significant detail that is sometimes passed over too quickly. The armor. The Mandalorian suit that had been his most consistent identifier across decades. The thing that the galaxy associated with his name before it associated anything else, was gone. Taken by Jawas while he was incapacitated. He was in the desert without it. Without resources. Without the identity that the armor represented and communicated. He was also injured. The details of his injuries are not exhaustively catalogued in the canon record, but the physical evidence visible in later accounts suggests damage that required significant recovery time. He was not operational. He was not in a position to reclaim his identity by force or by professional activity. He was a man in a desert, hurt, without the thing that told the world who he was. The Jawas who found him before the Tuskens took what they wanted and moved on. He had no capacity to prevent this. The transaction was entirely one-directional. Then the Tuskens found him. The Tusken Raiders, or the Tusken people, as the fuller picture of their culture makes more accurate, are one of the most consistently misrepresented groups in the galaxy's historical record. The accounts produced by settlers, traders, and imperial administrators describe them almost exclusively in terms of threat. Violent, territorial, dangerous to approach. The records that survived from Tatooine's colonial period treated them as an environmental hazard rather than as a culture with its own internal logic and history. The fuller picture, accessible through closer examination of their practices, and through the period of Boba's direct experience among them, is considerably more complex. They had language, not a simplified communication system but a full language, gestural, requiring physical expression alongside vocalization, carrying nuance and history, and the kind of layered meaning that only develops in communities with long continuous cultural memory. They had hierarchy and ritual, and the specific social structures that emerge when a group survives for generations in an environment that kills most things that try to live in it. They had a relationship to the Tatooine desert that was not simply a matter of adaptation. It was something closer to identity. The desert was not a place they endured. It was a place that had made them what they were. When they found Boba, they did not recognize him. He was a stranger from outside their world, physically compromised, wearing no identifying marks that meant anything within their framework. The decision about what to do with him was made according to their own logic, which had nothing to do with his history or his reputation. He was put to work, labor, carrying water, handling the physical tasks assigned to someone of no established status within the community. He was at the bottom. He had arrived there not through any failure of his own, but simply through the complete absence of anything that gave him standing. He did not resist this. That is the moment that reframes everything. Sit with it for a moment, because its implications run backward through the entire investigation. Boba Fett, who had been building and maintaining a specific professional identity since adolescence, who had worked for Darth Vader and Jabba the Hutt, whose name produced fear responses in people across the criminal underworld, whose reputation had been constructed over decades by some of the most powerful institutions in the galaxy, accepted a subordinate position in a community that did not know his name, not under duress in any simple sense. He was physically limited, yes, but the Tusken community was not a prison. He was not restrained in ways that prevented any alternative response. He could have focused entirely on recovering his armor, reclaiming his operational capacity, returning to the galaxy that knew who he was. That path was difficult, but not impossible. He did not take it, not immediately and apparently not with any urgency. Instead, he learned their language. This is the specific detail that carries the most weight. Language learning is not survival behavior. You do not need to learn someone's language to endure being among them for a limited period. You learn a language because you intend to be present long enough, and genuinely enough that communication matters, because you want to understand and be understood rather than simply to coexist until conditions change. Boba learned to speak with the Tusken people. He participated in their rituals. He fought alongside them when fighting was required. Not as Boba Fett the bounty hunter, but as a member of a specific community with specific relationships and specific obligations. He earned a place in that community through behavior that had nothing to do with his prior identity and everything to do with who he was willing to be in that context. He received Tusken markings, clothing, a position within the group's structure that reflected genuine integration rather than tolerated presence. At some point during this period, the canon record does not give a precise date. He seems to have been, in some functional sense, at peace. Now run that backward. If the man who spent 30 years as the galaxy's most feared bounty hunter was capable of setting that identity aside entirely, not under torture, not through psychological breakdown, but willingly, gradually, in the direction of a community and a life that asked nothing of his legend, then the identity was always optional. The armor was always a choice, and if it was always a choice, then every year he spent wearing it was also a choice, not a condition imposed by his genetics or his trauma, or the design Jango had set in motion on Kamino. A series of decisions made repeatedly to be the thing the galaxy knew rather than something else. This does not mean the choices were free in any simple sense. The context that shaped them was real. The grief was real. The skills he had were skills that only functioned in specific contexts. The world he had been prepared for was the bounty hunting world, and entering any other world would have required starting over in ways that would have cost him things he was not ready to lose. But he did start over. In the desert, among people who had no use for what he had been, he started over. And the fact that he was capable of it, that the capacity existed, is information that changes the shape of everything before it. The 3 million conditioned clones could not simply stop being soldiers. The conditioning was structural. It was inside them at a level that required extraordinary effort to resist. Rex had demonstrated that resistance was possible, but also that it required enormous cost. Boba stopped. He carried water. He learned to communicate in a language made of gesture and sound that had nothing to do with anything Jango had taught him. He became someone's companion in a culture that had no concept of what he had been before he arrived. The Kaminoans had called him unaltered. The evidence from Tatooine suggests they were more right than they knew. The Pike Syndicate destroyed the tribe. The specifics of the attack, when it occurred, the exact circumstances, the reasoning behind it, who gave the order, belong to a chapter of Tatooine's criminal history that this investigation will not fully trace tonight. What matters for this chapter is simpler. Boba came back to find them gone. The camp was destroyed. The people he had lived among, learned from, fought alongside. The community that had given him a place when he had no place, that had integrated him without knowing his name or caring about his history, were dead. Killed by people whose interest in Tatooine was purely extractive, who had no knowledge of and less concern for what the tribe represented, or what it had been. His response was not rage. This is the part that requires attention. A man defined by violence, with the skills to respond violently, and with what would appear to be clear justification for doing so, stood in the wreckage of something he had valued, and did not apparently immediately reach for the available violent response. He grieved. He built a funeral pyre. He performed the rite that the Tusken culture prescribed for their dead. He did this alone, without witnesses, in the desert, for people who could not see him do it. Then he recovered his armor from the person who had taken it. a complex sequence involving Fennec Shand, and a series of events that the canon record documents in reasonable detail. And he walked away from the place where the tribe had been. The grief is the pattern. It has appeared at every significant loss in his life: Geonosis, Florum, the desert. Each time, underneath whatever the external response looked like, the grief was there. Quiet, persistent, the thing that did not dissolve when circumstances changed or time passed. The thing that was, perhaps, the most honest constant in a life full of performed identities and cultivated reputations. He picked up his father's helmet at 10 years old, and he was grieving. He built a funeral pyre in the Tatooine desert, and he was grieving. The losses were different. The shape of the grief was the same. And now he was carrying his armor again, walking out of the desert, moving toward whatever came next. The Tusken markings were still on his skin beneath the suit. The language he had learned was still in his memory. The community that had made him a member was gone, but the fact of having been a member, the fact that he had been capable of it, was not gone. He carried both things: the armor and what was underneath it. What the Force, which had shaped every other significant figure in this galaxy's history, made of a man who carried both things, is the question the next chapter turns toward. The Force leaves marks. This is one of the most consistent observations across the entire history of the galaxy. From the earliest Jedi texts written on Tython 25,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, through the Sith traditions that developed in parallel, through every philosophical school and every fringe interpretation that emerged in the spaces between those two poles. Whatever else the various traditions disagreed about, and they disagreed about almost everything, they agreed on this: the Force moves through living things, and it leaves evidence of its passage. It shapes the people it touches. It connects them to each other and to events in ways that persist long after the specific moment has ended. Force-sensitive beings can read those traces the way a skilled tracker reads ground. Not perfectly, not without error, but with enough reliability that the traces constitute a kind of record. The galaxy's history is, in large part, a history written by people who could read that record. Jedi archivists documented events through the lens of Force perception. Sith Lords understood their opponents and their allies through the currents of the dark side. Even those who were not formally trained, beings with partial sensitivity, with undeveloped awareness, with what some traditions called a natural attunement, navigated the world with information that non-sensitive beings did not have access to. The Jedi Council sensed disturbances. They perceived threats before those threats became visible. They knew things about people and situations that the physical evidence alone could not have told them. This capacity shaped what got recorded and what did not. It shaped which events were understood as significant and which were overlooked. It shaped who the galaxy's most powerful institutions paid attention to and who they missed. Boba Fett existed entirely outside this perceptual system, not partially outside it, not on its edges, faintly detectable in the right conditions, completely absent from it, in a way that was deliberate at its origin, and then simply persisted as an inherited characteristic through every era of his life. Understanding what that absence meant, what it cost him, what it protected him from, and what it means for everything recorded about him, requires going back to where the absence was first selected for. Count Dooku arrived on Kamino with specific requirements. The timeline places his involvement in the Clone Army project in the decade before the Clone Wars began, during the period when the project was being established, when the Kaminoans needed both a client with resources and a genetic template with the right qualities. Dooku was operating under Darth Sidious's direction, building the pieces of a plan that would eventually produce exactly the galactic conflict both Sith wanted. The clone army was one of those pieces, an instrument that would serve the Republic in the short term and serve the Sith's larger agenda in the longer one. The selection of Jango Fett as the template was not arbitrary. It was not simply a matter of Jango being the most skilled bounty hunter available, though that was part of the calculation. Dooku, working from Sith understanding of how the Force operated and what it could and could not perceive, needed a template that would produce soldiers the Force could not easily read. Force-sensitive opponents, particularly Jedi, used their perceptual advantages in combat in ways that were extremely difficult to counter. They could anticipate movements, sense intentions, respond to threats before those threats became physically visible. An army composed of Force-sensitive soldiers would have been detectable to the Jedi in ways that would have compromised the plan. An army grown from a template with no Force connection, with genetics that simply did not carry the sensitivity, would move through the Force's perceptual field like shadows, present, physical, capable of enormous damage, but not generating the signals that Jedi perception depended on. Jango Fett was selected in part because the Force could not see him clearly. Boba inherited this quality. It was in the genetic material from which he was produced. It was not something added to him or something trained into him. It was simply the baseline of what he was, carried forward from the same source that produced 3 million soldiers, specifically because their presence would be difficult for Force-sensitive beings to anticipate or track. This is the origin of the absence. It began as a military and strategic calculation. It became, in Boba, something that extended far beyond its original purpose and shaped his entire relationship to the galaxy's most powerful institutions. Mace Windu killed Jango Fett. The speed and completeness of that outcome, a confrontation between one of the most capable non-Force-sensitive fighters alive and one of the most accomplished Jedi Masters of the era, ending in seconds, is sometimes cited as evidence of the Force's overwhelming advantage over ordinary ability. And in certain narrow senses, that reading is accurate. Windu's capacity was extraordinary. His connection to the Force, and specifically to Varpad, the seventh form of lightsaber combat that he had developed himself, a style that drew on the practitioner's own darkness and turned opponents' strength against them, gave him capabilities that no amount of conventional training could fully match. But the conclusion sometimes drawn from Jango's death, that the Force makes its practitioners invincible against non-sensitive opponents, is not supported by the broader record. Jango fought Windu in conditions that were chaotic and operationally disadvantaged. He was in an arena full of Jedi, surrounded by active combat, without the preparation and positioning that his best work required. The encounter was not representative of optimal conditions for a non-Force-sensitive fighter against a Force user. Boba understood this distinction. His adult career was built, in significant part, on it. The encounters he took against Jedi-aligned targets, documented across the Imperial period, when the remnants of the Jedi Order were being hunted, when surviving Force-sensitives existed in the galaxy's margins, showed a consistent approach. He did not meet Force users in direct confrontation when he could avoid it. He used preparation, positioning, environment, and the specific advantage that his Force invisibility provided. The inability of his targets to sense him coming. A Jedi who cannot perceive a threat until it manifests physically operates at a significant disadvantage, relative to a Jedi who can feel danger approaching through the Force. The early warning system, one of the practical advantages of Force sensitivity in combat, simply did not activate around Boba the way it would have activated around most threats. He was not in the Force's perceptual field in the way that other dangerous beings were. He arrived in a functional sense as a surprise. This quality cannot be overstated as a tactical asset. against opponents who had spent years developing instincts built on force perception. The absence of a force signature was worth more than most conventional combat advantages. It was not something he could have trained his way toward. It was not a skill or a technique or a product of discipline. It was simply what he was. The Hoth pursuit and the events at Bespin offer one of the most documented examples of Boba operating in the same space as force-sensitive individuals over an extended period. Luke Skywalker was present in the Hoth theater. He was, by that point in his development, a force-sensitive individual of significant capacity, not yet fully trained, still in the process of understanding what he was, but already demonstrating the kind of instinctive force awareness that had been present since his childhood. He could sense things. He could feel the force moving around events and people in ways that gave him information beyond the physical. The records from the Hoth period and the subsequent Bespin sequence contain multiple instances of Luke describing force perceptions, impressions, feelings, the sense of something present or absent or approaching. He described sensing Vader's presence before any visual confirmation. He described the force impressions of the people around him, their emotional states, their intentions. He left no recorded account of sensing Boba Fett. Not during the pursuit, not during the Bespin sequence, when Boba was present in the same facility, operating in close proximity to events that Luke was deeply invested in. Not during the engagement at the Pit of Carkoon, where Luke was physically present and fighting, and fully engaged with his force awareness. The absence of that record is interesting enough on its own. More interesting is what the absence implies about Luke's operational picture during those events. He was responding to information the Force was giving him, about Vader, about the people around him, about the danger in the environment. Boba Fett was part of that environment, a significant and dangerous part of it, and he apparently generated no Force impression that Luke found worth noting. Either Luke perceived him and judged the perception unremarkable enough not to record, or the perception simply did not occur. Boba passed through Luke's force awareness the way a shadow passes through light, present in physical terms, absent from the perceptual field that Luke was actually navigating. The second explanation is more consistent with what the broader record suggests about how force sensitivity interacts with the Fett genetic baseline. Yoda meditated on the galaxy for 900 years. That is not metaphor. Over the course of his extraordinarily long life, Yoda developed a relationship with the Force that most beings never approached. A depth of perception and awareness that allowed him to sense events and beings and currents of the Force across vast distances and long periods of time. His awareness of galactic events was not comprehensive. The Force is not omniscient, and neither were those most deeply connected to it. But it was more extensive than almost anything else the record documents. In Legends material covering the Clone Wars period and the early Imperial era, accounts exist of Yoda meditating on specific beings, sensing their connection to the Force, tracking their presence through the currents that connected all living things, perceiving their importance or danger to the galaxy's larger movements. Figures like Anakin Skywalker registered as almost overwhelming presences in those meditations. Too bright, too powerful, too consequential to miss. Figures connected to the dark side registered differently but still clearly. Dark nodes in the current, disturbances that demanded attention. Boba Fett does not appear in any surviving account of Yoda's Force perceptions. This is not conclusive. Yoda's documented meditations do not cover every being of significance in the galaxy, and the surviving record is not complete. It is possible that Boba appeared in perceptions that were not documented, or in documents that have not survived. But the pattern is consistent with everything else. Yoda, who perceived things that almost no other being could perceive, appears to have had no specific awareness of Boba Fett across the decades. When Boba was operating as one of the most consequential figures in the galactic underworld, the man who operated for Vader, who tracked the Empire's most wanted targets, who spent 30 years as the most feared bounty hunter alive. He moved through the Force's most sensitive observer without leaving a mark. There is something almost vertiginous about that, if you hold it long enough. The broader Jedi tradition had a concept for what Boba represented, though they never applied it to him directly. The idea of beings who were invisible to the Force, who existed somehow outside or beneath its perceptual field, appears in several ancient Jedi texts, most of them from the earliest periods of the Order's history, when the boundaries of Force understanding were still being mapped. These texts were largely theoretical. They described the concept as a philosophical possibility rather than a documented reality. The Force connected all living things, the texts argued, but the nature of that connection varied. Some beings were deeply embedded in the current. Some were peripheral, and some, in theory, might exist in such a way that the connection was present at a biological level, the Force still flowing through them, sustaining their life as it sustained all life, but generating no perceptual signal that other Force-sensitive beings could read. The Kaminoans, when they selected Jango's genetics for the Force-invisible quality Dooku required, were not working from Jedi theory. They were working from practical biological assessment. But the outcome they produced was consistent with what those ancient texts described. Boba Fett was alive. The Force moved through him the way it moved through all living things. He was not separate from the Force in any absolute sense. He simply generated no signal. He was, in the language of those ancient texts, below the perceptual threshold of Force awareness. Not dead to the Force, not cut off from it, just quiet in a way that the most sensitive instruments the galaxy possessed could not detect. What that meant for him internally, whether he experienced anything that might be described as Force awareness, however faint, however different from what trained Jedi experienced, is a question the record does not address. He never spoke about it in any surviving account. He never described any intuition or instinct that he attributed to the Force, or any absence of intuition that he attributed to its lack. He simply operated in the dark as far as Force perception was concerned, without complaint and apparently without awareness that the darkness was unusual. There is a specific quality to how Force-sensitive people described encounters with Boba Fett that is worth examining separately from the question of perception. When Jedi or other Force-sensitives described dangerous non-sensitive opponents, a certain kind of language appeared consistently. Language about the difficulty of anticipating someone whose intentions could not be felt in advance. About the disorientation of fighting, without the subtle advance information that Force awareness provided. About the specific challenge of being in a situation where the opponent was genuinely opaque, where the combat was happening entirely in physical space, without the Force dimension that most trained fighters incorporated automatically. This language does not appear in accounts of encounters with Boba Fett. The accounts that exist, Kenobi's brief observation on Kamino, the limited record from the Bespin period, do not describe this quality of disorientation. They describe him in ordinary terms, the way one might describe any competent and dangerous individual. Not as someone whose Force oplos created a specific experiential challenge, just as someone who was where he was and doing what he was doing. One possible explanation is that the encounters were brief enough, and the circumstances chaotic enough, that the specific quality of Force opos did not have time to register as distinct from the general difficulty of the situation. Another explanation is more interesting. Perhaps the Force-sensitive beings who encountered Boba Fett were not aware of his opacity, because they were not aware of what was absent. You do not feel the silence of something you did not know should be making sound. Kenobi did not leave Kamino thinking he had encountered someone Force-invisible. He left thinking he had encountered a dangerous bounty hunter who was hiding something. The texture of the encounter, the specific reason that something felt wrong, may have been invisible to him, precisely because the quality producing it was invisible to Force perception. The Force blind spot concealed itself. Consider what this means for the investigation as a whole. The history of the galaxy during Boba Fett's lifetime was shaped at every significant juncture by Force-sensitive beings. The Jedi Council made decisions based on Force perception. Darth Vader navigated the galaxy through the dark side. Palpatine, who saw further through the Force than almost anyone alive, built his plan across decades of careful perception and manipulation. All of these figures operated with a perceptual advantage that gave them information about the world and the people in it that ordinary beings did not have. And all of them, apparently, operated with a blind spot that covered Boba Fett specifically. Palpatine, who perceived threats to his rule with extraordinary sensitivity, employed Boba through intermediaries, but never, as far as any record shows, made him a specific object of Force perception or concern. Vader, who sensed the Force impressions of almost everyone he dealt with, worked with Boba across years without leaving any account of what that Force impression was. Because there may not have been one to describe, the galaxy's most powerful beings navigated around Boba Fett the way water navigates around a stone, not perceiving it, not engaging with it through the channels they used for everything else, simply moving around it. Because the stone did not participate in the current they were moving through, and because Force-sensitive beings wrote the history, because the Jedi archives and the Sith records and the accounts of Force-aware individuals constitute the backbone of what the galaxy understood about itself. The history they produced had a specific and consistent gap in it. The shape of a man who was never in the current. There is something worth sitting with at the end of this. The Force's absence in Boba's story is usually framed as a limitation. He could not do what Jedi could do. He could not access the awareness, the enhanced reflexes, the perceptual depth that Force sensitivity provided. He operated in a galaxy that ran on Force currency, and he had none to spend. But the Force's presence is not only an advantage, it is also a vulnerability. Force-sensitive beings are visible to each other in ways that Boba was never visible. They can be tracked through their Force signatures. They can be perceived at distances that should make them safe. They can be manipulated through the Force itself, influenced, suppressed, cut off from their connection in ways that are specifically designed to target their strength. The Sith spent millennia developing techniques for doing exactly this to Jedi. The Jedi developed counters. The entire history of the dark side and the light side is, in significant part, a history of Force-sensitive beings using the Force to attack and defend against other Force-sensitive beings. Boba existed entirely outside that war. He could not be tracked through the Force. He could not be perceived at a distance. He could not be manipulated through Force influence in the way that affected beings embedded in the current. The weapon the Sith used most reliably against the Jedi, the ability to sense, to target, to approach through dimensions that physical defenses could not cover, simply did not work on him. He was, in this specific and underappreciated sense, among the safest people alive in the galaxy's most dangerous centuries. Not because he was powerful, because he was quiet. Force-sensitive beings wrote the history of the galaxy. This is not a controversial observation. The major archives, the Jedi Temple records, the Sith holocron traditions, the accounts produced by Force-aware individuals across every era, constitute the primary documentary record of galactic history for most of the period this investigation covers. The beings who produced those records perceived the galaxy through a specific lens. They noticed what the Force made noticeable. They recorded what mattered to Force perception. What did not generate Force signals did not fully register. Which means that every account of Boba Fett produced by a Force-sensitive observer was, at a structural level, incomplete. Not because the observer was inattentive or inaccurate, because the perceptual system they were using had a systematic gap where he was concerned. They saw his actions. They observed his presence. They recorded what he did in the physical world. They could not perceive the current beneath his actions, the motivations, the inner life, the quality of being that Force perception might have revealed if it had been able to reach him. The history they produced was, in that specific sense, a history of his surface. What lay beneath the surface, the grief, the code, the things held back from every witness who tried to see them. The person who learned Tuscan language in a desert and carried funeral rites for people who had no one else to perform them, that did not make it into the Force-written record. It existed. It shaped everything he did. It was arguably the most important thing about him. It simply was not there in the history that survives. The next chapter takes all the interpretations built on that incomplete foundation, the theories, the competing explanations, the different ways the galaxy tried to make sense of a man it could not fully see, and lays them side by side, not to choose between them, to show what they look like when held together. Every investigation reaches a point where the evidence stops accumulating and the interpretation begins. This is that point. 8 chapters of documented history, witness accounts, physical evidence, Force analysis, and parallel examination have produced a substantial body of material. The timeline is as complete as surviving records allow. The witnesses have been examined for reliability and bias. The myth has been separated from the documented behavior. The Force's absence has been considered as a structural feature of the record, rather than simply a biographical detail. What remains is the question the investigation began with. Who was he? Not what he did. Not what the galaxy believed about him. Not the accumulated reputation, or the manufactured legend, or the name that produced fear responses in people who had never met the man behind it. The simpler and more resistant question underneath all of that. Who was Boba Fett actually? 4 interpretations exist. Each has genuine supporting evidence. Each accounts for significant portions of the record. Each also has a point where it breaks, where the evidence it cannot explain sits quietly and refuses to be dismissed. This chapter presents all 4. It does not choose between them. The record does not support choosing, and pretending otherwise would be a disservice to the complexity of what the investigation has assembled. Hold all 4 simultaneously. That is the only honest position the evidence allows. The first interpretation, the Hollow Man. The case for this interpretation begins with a simple observation. Every witness who spent time near Boba Fett described behavior. Nobody described inner life. Not Solo, whose accounts were filtered through fear, but were still the accounts of an observant person in close proximity. Not Leia, who was a trained observer with specific attention to what people communicated beyond their words. Not Dengar, who spent extended time with Boba during recovery, and had every opportunity to see past the professional surface. Not even Fennec, who knew him better in his later years than almost anyone alive. The absence is total across decades and multiple observers coming from completely different contexts. The Hollow Man interpretation argues that this absence is not concealment. It is not a man hiding something. It is the accurate report of what was there to see. The witnesses described behavior because behavior was what existed, the inner life that the investigation has been searching for. The grief, the code, the hidden self beneath the professional surface, is a projection. Something the investigation has been reading into the gaps, rather than finding within them. Consider the origin point. Jango Fett requested an unaltered clone. He wanted a son. But what did Jango Fett actually know about producing a psychologically complete person? He was a bounty hunter. His expertise was operational. His understanding of what a child needed to develop a full inner life was, by any reasonable assessment, incomplete. He provided training. He provided skills. He provided proximity. What he may not have provided, what the record does not show him providing, is the kind of sustained, emotional engagement that produces depth, rather than simply competence. The behavioral conditioning given to the clone troopers is often framed as a limitation compared to Boba's unaltered status. But conditioning, whatever its costs, provides structure. It provides a framework for understanding the self and one's place in the world. Boba received no such framework. He received skills and then loss, in that order, before he was old enough to have built anything of his own to fill the space. What if the space simply stayed empty? The behavioral consistency across every era of his life is, under this interpretation, the consistency of a well-designed instrument, rather than the consistency of a coherent identity. He was reliable because reliability was what had been built into him, not because he had chosen it from a position of self-awareness. He kept his word because Jango's lessons had installed that quality before anything else was present to examine or question it. He survived because survival was the one function that everything in his formation had been oriented toward. The grief that this investigation has identified as a recurring constant, the Geonosis loss, the Florum abandonment, the Tuscan destruction, could be read differently under this interpretation. Not as evidence of a rich inner life responding to loss, as a stimulus-response pattern, the removal of a primary attachment figure, producing a specific behavioral output that looked like grief from the outside, because grief is what the same stimulus produces in beings with genuine inner lives. The Hollow Man interpretation does not claim Boba was unconscious or unaware. It claims something more precise and more unsettling, that awareness and inner life are not the same thing. That a being can be fully present, fully functional, fully capable of sophisticated behavior in complex situations, and still have nothing behind the eyes that would constitute a self in any meaningful sense. Where this interpretation breaks is the Tuscan period. A purely functional instrument does not learn an unnecessary language. It does not perform funeral rites for people who cannot witness the performance. It does not, apparently, experience something resembling peace in a community that has stripped away every element of its professional identity. These behaviors do not serve the functional purpose of survival or professional effectiveness. They serve something else, something internal, something that the Hollow Man interpretation has no framework for explaining. The interpretation handles this by suggesting the Tuscan behavior was conditioned response to a new environment, adaptation without genuine investment. But that explanation requires treating the language learning and the community integration as purely mechanical, and the evidence does not comfortably support that reading. The Hollow Man is the cleanest interpretation. It is also the one that fits the least evidence from the final decade of his documented life. The second interpretation, the grieving son. This interpretation begins exactly where the first one ends. The language, the funeral rites, the peace that appeared to exist, briefly, in a community that had no use for what he had been. These are not the behaviors of an empty instrument. They are the behaviors of someone who had been carrying something for a very long time, and found, in an unexpected context, a temporary place to set it down. The grieving son interpretation argues that everything Boba Fett did across 6 decades of documented history traces back to a single unresolved event. A 10-year-old boy in an arena on Geonosis, picking up a helmet that belonged to the only person who had ever mattered to him. In a galaxy that had just demonstrated it would keep moving regardless of what he lost. Map his significant choices against this framework, and the pattern becomes visible. His first independent act was not an act of ambition or professional development. It was an attempt to punish the specific person responsible for his loss. The endurance bombing was not strategically sound. It was not well planned, relative to what his skills and resources could have produced under different circumstances. It was grief wearing the mask of revenge, an emotional response performing as a tactical operation. His extended career in bounty hunting, under this reading, was not primarily about money or reputation or professional identity. It was the only structure available to a person formed for that specific purpose, maintained because the alternative, stopping, sitting still, acknowledging what was underneath the activity, was not something the formation had equipped him to do. His relationship to the Mandalorian armor is central to this interpretation. The armor was not simply equipment. It was inheritance. It was the tangible continuation of the person whose loss had defined him. Every time he wore it, he was carrying his father forward. The fact that he continued wearing it across 30 years, repairing it, maintaining it, recovering it after the Sarlacc, when abandoning it would have been operationally simpler, speaks to a relationship with the object that goes beyond professional attachment. The Tuscan period is this interpretation's strongest evidence. He did not go looking for family. He fell into a situation where a community adopted him, and he allowed it. He let himself be integrated into something that functioned like belonging. He learned the language. He accepted the position. He stayed long enough that the loss of the tribe, when it came, produced the same quality of response that the loss on Geonosis had produced. Grief, again, the same shape. 40 years later in a different desert, for different people, but the same fundamental thing. The grieving son interpretation argues that the governing fact of his life was not violence or professionalism or reputation. It was the thing he started with and kept returning to, loss and the inability to stop responding to it with the same quiet devastation. Where this interpretation breaks is the question of agency. It risks making Boba entirely reactive, a person defined by what happened to him rather than by any genuine self-determination. And the record contains evidence of choices that were not simply grief responses. The contracts he declined, the professional limits he maintained that had no emotional logic. The specific quality of his work that other hunters described as going beyond what grief or conditioning alone would produce. Something was choosing in those moments. Something with preferences and principles that were not simply the residue of loss. The grieving son explains a great deal. It does not explain everything. The man was more than his damage, and this interpretation sometimes struggles to account for the parts that were not. The third interpretation. The survivor's philosophy. This interpretation does not look for a stable self beneath the behavior. It argues that there is no stable self to find, and that this is not a problem to be solved, but a description of how survival actually works in conditions like the ones Boba Fett inhabited across his entire life. Each major period of his history ended in the destruction of what the previous period had built. Geonosis destroyed the sun. Florum destroyed the grieving child who had tried to find guidance in dangerous allies. The endurance failure and the imprisonment destroyed the adolescent, who believed revenge was achievable through direct action. The Imperial era career built a professional identity that the fall of the Empire then rendered contextless. The Sarlacc destroyed even the physical continuity of the body. Emerging from it, He was not biologically the same person who fell in the sense that the damage was permanent and transformative. The Tusken adoption built something that the Pike Syndicate then destroyed. Each time, what emerged was recognizably related to what came before but not identical to it. The skills persisted, the name persisted, the armor persisted, repaired and maintained across every transition. But the self that wore the armor, the specific configuration of priorities and responses and internal architecture, shifted with each destruction and reconstruction. The survivor's philosophy interpretation argues that this is not a failure of identity formation. It is a successful adaptation strategy. A person who maintains a rigid, stable identity across conditions that repeatedly and catastrophically destroy the foundations of that identity is a person who breaks. Boba did not break. He shed the version of himself that the destroyed context had required and assembled something functional from what remained. This interpretation handles the Tusken period elegantly. The man who accepted a subordinate position in a Tusken community was not the same man who had worked for Vader. That version of him had already been shed in the Sarlacc. What emerged from the desert was not carrying the Imperial-era identity in any operative sense. It was something new, formed partly from what the previous versions had left behind, and partly from the specific conditions of recovery and adoption. The armor being reclaimed after the Tusken destruction was not the previous identity being resumed. It was the new version reaching for the one thread of continuity that connected all the previous versions. Not the identity the armor represented, but the physical object that had been present through all of them. A through line rather than a return. Where this interpretation breaks is precisely at that through line. If there is no stable self, if Boba is simply a sequence of contextually adapted versions, what maintains the consistency that every witness described? The behavioral pattern is too stable across too many different versions to be explained purely by sequential adaptation. The code that other hunters noticed, the specific limits he maintained, the grief response that appeared in the same form across 40 years and multiple reinventions. Something persisted through the destructions. The survivor's philosophy is excellent at explaining change. It is less persuasive about continuity, and the continuity is real. The fourth interpretation. The mirror. This interpretation starts from the outside and works inward. It argues that the question of who Boba Fett actually was may be unanswerable, not because the person was mysterious in some deep and irreducible sense, but because the galaxy's need for a figure like him was so powerful and so consistent that it overwrote whatever he actually was before anyone had the chance to look clearly. Every institution that encountered him needed him to be something specific. The Republic needed him to be a threat accessible through legal and military frameworks, a criminal, a dangerous juvenile, something that could be convicted and contained. The Imperial military needed him to be a reliable instrument, something that could be aimed and would hit what it was pointed at. Jabba's organization needed him to be a legend, something whose name alone produced the compliance that Jabba's actual power required to function. The bounty hunting community needed him to be a standard, a measure of what the profession's highest level looked like. The Rebel Alliance needed him to be an obstacle, a specific kind of danger that its operatives had to account for. None of these institutions were interested in who he was, beyond the function he served for them. Each one produced an account of him, shaped by what they needed the account to contain. The galaxy has a long history of doing this to specific figures, producing people whose function is so useful that the function becomes the story and the person disappears inside it. Boba was particularly vulnerable to this process because the Force invisibility that this investigation examined in the previous chapter meant that the one perceptual system capable of seeing past surfaces had no access to him. Nobody could check the institutional account against force perception. Nobody could verify whether the mirror was reflecting something real or simply the face of the observer. The mirror interpretation suggests that the mystery of Boba Fett is not a mystery about a deep and hidden self. It is a mystery about the galaxy's need to produce and maintain a specific kind of figure. The emptiness at the center of the record is not emptiness in the man. It is the space where the projections accumulated, layer on layer, until the original surface was no longer visible. Where this interpretation breaks is the Tuscan period. Again, a mirror has no preferences about what it reflects. It does not voluntarily step outside the frame. The man who carried water and learned Tuscan language was not serving any institutional function. He was not reflecting anyone's projection back at them. He was doing something entirely self-directed, in a context where no institution was watching and no reputation was at stake. That behavior cannot be explained by projection. It requires a self doing the choosing. The mirror in that moment stopped being a mirror and became a person. 4 interpretations, each one true in part, each one failing somewhere, each one accounting for evidence the others struggle to explain. The hollow man explains the behavioral surface but cannot account for the Tuscan integration. The grieving son explains the emotional continuity but underestimates the agency. The survivor's philosophy explains the transformations but struggles with the consistency. The mirror explains the institutional record but breaks against the moments of genuine self-direction. Together, they form something. Not an answer, an outline. The shape of a person seen from 4 different angles simultaneously. The composite image that emerges when you hold all 4 views at once and look at where they agree. They agree that the surface was real and that something produced it consistently across decades. They agree that the loss was foundational and that it never fully resolved. They agree that the identity was constructed, maintained, and eventually, partially, briefly, in a desert community that did not know his name, set aside. They agree, in their overlapping and contradictory ways, that there was someone there. That the silence was not emptiness. That behind the visor, beneath the armor, inside the legend that powerful institutions had built and maintained, and eventually outlived, there was a person who the record mostly missed. Whether that outline is enough, whether the shape of someone is sufficient when the person themselves remains out of reach, is the question the final chapter holds. It may reveal more about what the questioner needs than about what the subject was. Start with what is known, not the legend, not the myth assembled by powerful institutions with specific needs, not the reputation that preceded him into rooms and made people adjust their behavior before he crossed the threshold. The documented record. The things the investigation has actually established across 9 chapters of careful examination. A child was produced on Camino from specific genetic material by deliberate design without the conditioning that shaped 3 million others from the same source. He was raised by a man who understood violence, professionally, and honor, personally, and who died before the transmission was complete. He spent his adolescence in the care of people who taught him that care had a ceiling, and that the ceiling would reveal itself at the worst possible moment. He built a career in the most dangerous profession available to him, using the skills he had been given in the world his teachers had prepared him for. He worked for a Sith Lord. He worked for a crime lord. He maintained a code that neither employer had installed, and neither could fully account for. He fell into a creature that should have ended him and came back out. He accepted a place at the bottom of a community that did not know his name and found in that place something the record hesitantly identifies as peace. He lost that community to violence. He grieved for it. He reclaimed his armor and walked back out into a galaxy that still did not know what to make of him. He chose, eventually, to govern a small desert world on the edge of charted space. That is the documented record. That is what the investigation has assembled. The question it was assembled to answer is still open. Jabba's palace sits on the edge of the Dune Sea on Tatooine's northern Dune Sea plateau, a squat, fortress-like structure built into the rock, designed to communicate permanence and intimidation in equal measure. For decades, it was the center of one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the Outer Rim. Jabba the Hutt ruled from it, received clients and supplicants in it, maintained the hierarchies and debts and obligations that kept his network functional. When Jabba died, the palace waited. Other organizations moved through it. Power structures shifted. The post-imperial reorganization of the Outer Rim's criminal landscape produced new configurations of authority that the palace was eventually drawn into. For a period, it was contested space, wanted by multiple parties for what it represented as much as for what it practically offered. Boba Fett sat down in the throne. This moment, the specific image of him taking the seat that Jabba had occupied, in a room that had been designed as a theater of criminal power, has been interpreted in almost as many ways as the man himself. The obvious reading is continuation. The most feared bounty hunter in the galaxy transitioning into the role of crime lord, trading one form of power for another, moving up the hierarchy rather than sideways. But the obvious reading is the one that requires the least engagement with everything the investigation has uncovered. And by this point in the record, the obvious reading has earned a degree of suspicion. Boba did not take the throne because he wanted to be Jabba. The evidence for this is not subtle. He said, in terms that Fennec Shand documented and that the canon record preserves, that he intended to rule differently. Not through fear, through respect. The distinction between those two words was not casual or rhetorical for him. He had spent 30 years operating in the currency of fear. He understood exactly what it purchased and exactly what it cost. He was choosing to operate in different currency, deliberately, with full awareness of what the change meant. That choice is the investigation's final and most revealing piece of evidence. Governing Tatooine was not a natural extension of anything Boba Fett had built across his career. Bounty hunting required no community relationships. It required targets and clients, and the skills to move between them efficiently. It was, structurally, a solitary profession, or at most a profession of small temporary alliances for specific operational purposes. The relationships it demanded were transactional by definition. They began with a contract and ended with delivery. Governance requires something else entirely. It requires sustained presence in a community. It requires being known as a specific person with specific commitments, rather than as a reputation that precedes and follows you. It requires the kind of reliability that cannot be demonstrated through a single completed contract, but only through the accumulation of consistent behavior across time and varied circumstances. It requires, in a word, roots. A man defined by the hollow man interpretation would not have chosen this. An empty instrument does not develop preferences for one form of operation over another. It does what it is deployed to do. The choice to stop being deployed and start governing. To exchange the freedom of the hunter for the obligations of a ruler is not a choice that emerges from emptiness. It emerges from something that knows what it wants and has finally identified the conditions under which it might be obtained. A man defined purely by the grieving son interpretation would also not have chosen this, or not in this form. Grief seeks reunion or revenge or oblivion. It does not, typically, seek administrative responsibility in a difficult environment. The governing choice was something beyond grief. It was, in the direction it pointed, something like construction, like someone who had spent decades in the demolition business, finally wanting to build something that would remain. The survivor's philosophy interpretation handles this transition well. It is another shedding, another emergence from a destroyed context into a new form, but it still does not fully explain the specific content of the choice. Survival could have been achieved in many forms. He chose this one. The choice itself contains information that pure survival logic does not account, for the mirror interpretation breaks entirely against this period. No institution was projecting this image onto him. No powerful employer needed him to be a crime lord ruling through respect rather than fear. The projection had ended with the imperial era. What he chose in its absence was chosen without an audience to choose for. The governing period is the most honest evidence this investigation has. It is Boba Fett making a choice in a context where the choice served no institutional function, maintained no prior reputation, and fulfilled no designed purpose. It was, as far as any external analysis can determine, what he actually wanted. And what he actually wanted was a place. A stable one, with people in it who knew his name and were not afraid of it. The record of his governance on Tatooine is not extensive. The events documented in canon during this period cover specific operational challenges: the Pike Syndicate's presence, the various criminal organizations attempting to contest his authority, the specific conflicts that arose from his decision to rule through relationships rather than pure force projection. These events are recorded because they involved violence and visible confrontation, which is what tends to make it into the surviving record. What is not extensively documented is the texture of the governance itself. The daily decisions, the relationships built over time with the people of Mos Espa and the surrounding communities, the specific way Boba Fett navigated the role of a ruler who did not have traditional criminal lord legitimacy, but was trying to build something resembling real authority. Fennec Shan's presence throughout this period provides one window into it. Her observations, the ones this investigation examined in Chapter 5, describe someone working seriously at the problem of governance, approaching it with the same operational discipline he had brought to bounty hunting, but oriented toward a fundamentally different outcome, not toward the completion of a contract, toward the establishment of something durable. There is a specific account from this period that carries unusual weight in the context of everything the investigation has assembled. During the conflict with the Pike Syndicate, the organization that had been responsible for the destruction of his Tusken tribe, Boba Fett made choices that were operationally suboptimal by pure efficiency standards. He refused certain methods. He maintained certain limits. He chose approaches that cost him tactical advantages because those approaches were consistent with the kind of ruler he had decided to be. These choices did not produce immediate operational benefits. They produced losses, temporarily, and required recovery. A purely strategic operator would not have made them. Someone motivated entirely by power would not have made them. They were made by someone with a code. The same code that other bounty hunters had noticed across the Imperial era. The same code that the official legend had consistently failed to account for. Still present, still operative, still shaping behavior in directions that pure self-interest logic could not predict. The code had survived 30 years of bounty hunting, the Sarlacc, the desert, and the destruction of every community and context it had operated within. It was, at this point in the evidence, the most consistent thing the investigation had found. Now return to the original question one more time. Who was Boba Fett, beneath everything the galaxy made him? The investigation has assembled enough evidence to say something careful and honest about this, even if it cannot say something complete. He was a person who lost the primary structure of his identity at 10 years old and spent the following decades building functional replacements that were never quite the thing that had been lost. The replacements worked. Some of them worked very well, but they were always replacements, practical constructions rather than the foundational thing itself. He was a person whose most defining characteristic, beneath the skills and the reputation and the armor, was the persistence of grief. Not in the sense of being broken by loss. The evidence does not support that reading. In the sense of taking loss seriously, of not moving past it in the way that pure resilience would have required, but instead carrying it, integrating it, letting it inform his behavior in ways that pure professionalism would have edited out. The grief was not a weakness. It was the most human thing about him, and he apparently refused to shed it, even when shedding it would have been operationally convenient. He was a person with a code that predated his conscious awareness of having one, and survived every attempt, deliberate or circumstantial, to overwrite it. Django installed its foundations. The subsequent decades of damage and recovery and loss and reinvention could not remove them. They persisted the way certain structures persist. Not because they are maintained deliberately, but because they are load-bearing. Because the thing they support is the whole architecture, and removing them would bring everything down. He was a person who, given the first genuine opportunity to choose what he actually wanted, rather than what his formation had prepared him for, chose belonging, chose the attempt at community, at permanence, at being known as a person, rather than as a reputation. The Tuscan adoption was the first version of this choice, made in desperate circumstances, without the resources to protect it. The Tatooine governance was the second version, made deliberately, with full awareness of the cost, and with the specific intention of building something that would last. Both were destroyed or threatened. Neither destroyed his willingness to try again. That willingness, the persistence of the attempt across repeated failures, is perhaps the most revealing thing the investigation has found. It suggests someone who knew what they were trying to reach, even when they could not articulate it. Someone for whom the absence of belonging was a real and specific deprivation, rather than simply a neutral condition to be adapted to. The galaxy never resolved its relationship to this person. Every institution that encountered him tried to categorize him and failed. The Republic convicted him as a criminal and released him, and found he did not fit the category neatly enough to stay in it. The Empire employed him as an instrument, and found the instrument had limits that instruments are not supposed to have. The criminal underworld built a legend around him, and found the legend did not match the behavior it was supposed to describe. The Jedi could not perceive him, and therefore could not include him in the interpretive framework through which they understood galactic events. The Tuscan people, who were the only ones who ever engaged with him without a prior category to impose, were destroyed before the relationship could produce a complete record. Tatooine, under his governance, remained complicated. The world did not simply resolve into the stable and respectful community he was trying to build. The resistance was real. The difficulties were real. The gap between what he wanted the governance to be and what the available conditions allowed it to be was real and persistent. He worked within that gap anyway, brought Fennec alongside him, made specific choices that were oriented toward the goal, even when the goal remained distant, did not abandon the attempt because the attempt was difficult. That is the last image the record gives us of Boba Fett as an active figure in galactic events, not a triumphant resolution, not a completed transformation. A man in the middle of a difficult project, working on it seriously, with the same operational discipline he had brought to everything else in his life, but pointed, finally, toward something he had chosen. There is a question this investigation has been building toward, that it has not yet asked directly. Why does the galaxy keep asking about him? Not in the sense of scholarly investigation, though this is an instance of that. In the broader sense, why does his name persist in the record, with a weight that figures of comparable operational significance do not have? Why do people who know only the surface of his story still find it compelling enough to return to? Why does the mystery feel like a mystery worth holding, rather than simply a gap in documentation that time and circumstance produced? The answer is not that he was more powerful than other figures in his era. He was not. The answer is not that his operational record was more extensive or more consequential than other hunters and criminals and soldiers who moved through the same decades. It was not, by any objective measure. The answer is something more specific. He refused. Not loudly, not with stated principles or public declarations. Quietly, consistently, across every institution that tried to define him, across every powerful figure who tried to deploy him as a simple instrument, across every legend that tried to reduce him to a function. He refused to be only what he was being asked to be. The Republic asked him to be a convict. He served his time and came out with his code intact. The Empire asked him to be a weapon without limits. He maintained limits that the Empire had not installed and could not remove. Jabba asked him to be a legend. He was reliable and professional, and never became the legend's simplest version. The Sarlacc asked him to be dead. He declined. The desert asked him to be broken. He carried water instead. Every time the galaxy provided a category and pointed him toward it, something in him held back. Something refused the full completion of the assignment. Not with drama, not with visible resistance, not in any way that would have been legible to most observers, but with a consistent and apparently indestructible refusal to be entirely what the available frameworks required. That refusal is the mystery, not a mystery of hidden information waiting to be uncovered, a mystery of persistent selfhood under conditions specifically designed to eliminate it. He was made to be a copy. He became a specific and unrepeatable person. He was formed to be a soldier. He became a hunter. He was built into a legend. He was also a man who learned Tuscan grammar and performed desert funeral rites alone. He was invisible to the Force. He was entirely visible to grief. He was feared by almost everyone who knew his name. He wanted to be respected, which is a completely different thing. And he spent the last documented period of his life working toward it, in a context that made it genuinely difficult. The helmet is still there. The Mandalorian iron has held across everything it was taken through. The green and silver finish is worn in specific places, use marks, repair marks, the accumulated evidence of decades of survival in conditions that were not designed to be survived. The dent on the left side above the visor has never been repaired. Whether this was a choice or simply an oversight, whether he kept the dent because it meant something or because the armor had accumulated enough marks that one more was unremarkable, is not something the record addresses. The visor is dark. It has always been dark. No surviving image of Boba Fett shows what is behind it in any meaningful sense. The visor was designed to protect and to conceal simultaneously, and it accomplished both functions with complete consistency across every era of his documented life. Behind it, across all those years and all those contracts and all those losses and all those carefully maintained silences, there was a person. The investigation has not been able to fully reach that person. Neither has any other investigation conducted from any angle, using any available evidence. The record stops at the surface. The witnesses stopped at the surface. The Force, which sees past most surfaces, could not reach this one. What the investigation has established is the shape of the mystery rather than its contents. The outline of a person assembled from what the available evidence allows. filled in at the edges by the four interpretations that all partially fit and none fully fit, bounded by the consistent pattern of a code that survived everything, and a grief that never resolved, and a willingness to keep trying for belonging, that the available circumstances repeatedly and comprehensively punished. That outline is not nothing. An outline is a real thing. It has contours. It has specific places where it extends further than expected, and specific places where it is shallower than the legend suggested. It has a consistency across decades that tells you something genuine about the person it describes. It is not the person, but it is the closest the record allows. Somewhere on Tatooine, the work was continuing, the day-to-day maintenance of a governance that was not finished. The specific and unglamorous work of building something durable in a place and a context that had historically resisted durability. Fennec beside him, doing her own work in the same direction. The desert outside, ancient and indifferent. The same desert that had returned him from the Sarlacc, the same desert where the Tusken camp had stood and where the funeral pyre had burned. The galaxy, out beyond the edge of the Dune Sea, continuing to be the galaxy. Complex, violent, unwilling to hold still long enough for anything built within it to fully stabilize. The same galaxy it had always been. And somewhere inside the administration of a difficult small world on its edges, a man with a dented helmet and a code nobody had fully mapped was doing the work he had chosen to do. Not because the galaxy had asked him to. Not because any institution had pointed him toward it. Because it was, as far as the available evidence allows any conclusion at all, what he had been trying to reach for a very long time. The question of who he was remains open. It will remain open after this investigation ends. It will remain open after every other investigation that follows. Not because the man was unknowable, because the galaxy looked at him and saw what it needed, and what it needed kept changing, and by the time anything settled long enough to look clearly, the moment had already passed. He is still in there. Behind the visor. Behind the dent that no official source has ever fully explained. Behind the legend and the myth and all the four interpretations that each account for, part of what the evidence shows. Present still, not looking back, waiting perhaps for someone to ask the question, without already knowing what answer they need.